Let me tell you a story not of honor, not of a romanticized code, but of pure, unadulterated predatory instinct wearing the skin of a man. This is the story of Anthony Casso, a name that would become a whispered curse in the underworld, a specter of violence that haunted the streets of New York long before the authorities even knew who they were truly dealing with. Our journey begins not in a blaze of gunfire, though there would be plenty of that, but in the quiet, working-class neighborhood of Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, in the year 1940, a place and a time where the Mafia was not just a criminal organization but a shadow government, a twisted alternative for ambitious young men who saw the American dream as too slow, too lawful, and far too dull. From his earliest days, Anthony was immersed in this culture. His father, Michael Casso, was a high-ranking member of the Lucchese crime family, involved in lucrative rackets like gambling and loan sharking, which meant the young boy saw figures of immense power and feared respect visiting his home, men who carried themselves with an aura of invincibility and who commanded a neighborhood with a nod or a frown. This was his normal, his classroom, and the curriculum was power, fear, and the absolute belief that the world was divided into predators and prey. While other children were playing stickball, Anthony was learning the intricate social map of his neighborhood, understanding which stores were fronts for illegal operations, which social clubs were forbidden territories where serious men discussed serious things, and which individuals carried the unspoken authority that made everyone else lower their eyes. He was a keen observer, a quiet boy who absorbed every lesson in brutality and cunning that his environment offered, and he quickly learned that in his world, compassion was a weakness and mercy was a flaw that could get you killed. His education was furthered on the streets, where he ran with a gang of like-minded youths, and it was here he earned the nickname that would stick with him for life, Gaspipe, a moniker that sources suggest came from his youthful prowess and willingness to use any weapon at hand, including a section of lead pipe, but which would later evolve to symbolize the relentless, pressurized, and explosive fury he could direct at his enemies. This was not a nickname born of affection, but one earned through fear and a reputation for being unpredictably and supremely violent, a young man who relished the feeling of dominance that came from inflicting pain and terror. He dropped out of school in the 8th grade, seeing formal education as pointless for the life he had chosen, a life that was already accelerating when, at the age of 17, he committed his first murder, a grim and bloody baptism that cemented his path and proved to the older mafiosi that this was not just another street thug, but a rare and dangerous breed, a natural killer without the hesitation or conscience that hampered lesser men. The victim was a small-time criminal who had made the fatal mistake of crossing the Lucchese family, and young Anthony was given the contract as a test, a task he carried out with a cold efficiency that shocked even his hardened mentors, establishing his value not as a mere enforcer, but as a premier assassin, a clean and effective weapon who could be pointed at a problem and trusted to make it disappear permanently. This first kill was a gateway, and Anthony Casso walked through it without a backward glance, his appetite for violence only growing, his ambition burning brighter as he climbed the crooked ladder of the Mafia, building his reputation one body at a time. He understood that in this world, respect was paramount, but it was fear that was the real currency, and he set about amassing a fortune of it, ensuring that the mere mention of his name, Gaspipe, would cause hardened gangsters to shift uneasily in their seats. He married his childhood sweetheart, Lillian, and presented a facade of a normal family man, a devoted husband and father. But this domestic life was merely a cover, a quiet port in the storm of his real existence, which was a whirlwind of illicit meetings, clandestine plots, and brutal acts of violence that defined his every waking moment. He was a man living two parallel lives, one of suburban normalcy and the other of a rising monster in the underworld, and he navigated both with a chilling duality that would become his trademark. By the time he was in his late 20s, Anthony Casso was a made man in the Lucchese family, a formal induction that required a blood oath of loyalty, a ceremony where he swore allegiance to the family above all else, even his own blood, an oath he would ultimately break in the most spectacular and damning fashion. But for now, it was the culmination of his childhood dreams, the official stamp on the life he had always wanted. He was no longer just Michael Casso's son, he was a power in his own right, a earner who brought in massive profits from the hijacking of trucks at JFK Airport, a racket he controlled with an iron fist, and a feared assassin whose services were in high demand, not just from his own family, but from others who needed a problem permanently and quietly eliminated. This was the rise, the careful, bloody, and calculated ascent of a psychopath within a system that, for a time, rewarded his particular set of skills, a system that believed it could control the demon it was unleashing upon its enemies, little realizing that a creature of such pure, selfish malice could never be truly controlled, and would one day turn on its masters with a ferocity that would shake the very foundations of La Cosa Nostra. The 1970s and 80s became the forge in which Anthony Gaspipe Casso's legend was tempered into a weapon of terrifying precision. A period where he evolved from a promising young assassin into a strategic criminal mastermind whose operational brilliance was matched only by his capacity for ruthlessness. And it was during this era that he began to form the alliances that would both empower and ultimately entrap him. Most notably his partnership with the equally formidable underboss of the Gambino crime family, Sammy the Bull Gravano, a relationship built not on friendship, for men like them were incapable of such a sentiment, but on a mutual recognition of each other's lethal efficiency and a shared understanding that together they could undertake ventures too ambitious for any single family. Casso's primary domain was the sprawling, chaotic ecosystem of JFK Airport, which he treated as his personal treasury, masterminding a complex and highly lucrative web of cargo hijackings that involved inside information from corrupt union officials, carefully planned ambushes by teams of skilled thieves, and a distribution network for stolen goods that stretched across the city, generating millions of dollars in untaxed revenue that flowed directly into the coffers of the Lucchese family and cemented his status as a top earner, a man whose financial contributions guaranteed him influence and protection from the highest levels of the organization. But his ambitions stretched far beyond the tarmac. He saw the burgeoning drug trade, particularly the explosion of the heroin market, not as a forbidden fruit as per the Mafia's often ignored official ban on narcotics, but as an irresistible opportunity, and he plunged into it with characteristic audacity, setting up sophisticated importation pipelines and distribution channels that flooded the streets with poison and further lined his pockets. An enterprise that, while wildly profitable, placed him at odds with more traditionalist elements within the mob who still paid lip service to the old rules. It was this foray into narcotics that would lead him to one of his most infamous and cold-blooded acts, the brutal 1986 murder of NYPD Detective Peter Calabro, a dedicated officer who had been aggressively investigating Casso's drug operations and was getting dangerously close to uncovering the entire network, a situation that Casso could not and would not tolerate, viewing the detective not as an upholder of the law but as a direct threat to his business, a problem that required a permanent solution. The hit was carried out with chilling professionalism, a stark demonstration of Casso's belief that no one was beyond his reach, not even a decorated police officer, and it sent a shockwave through the entire city, a clear message that Anthony Casso operated by his own set of rules where any obstacle, regardless of its badge or authority, would be mercilessly eliminated. This was the core of the man. He was a predator who saw the world as his hunting ground, and he refused to acknowledge any fences, any boundaries between himself and his prey, a trait that made him incredibly powerful but also painted an enormous target on his back, attracting the relentless attention of federal law enforcement who now saw him not just as a gangster but as a top-tier priority, a symbol of the Mafia's brazen defiance. His life was a constant, high-stakes chess game, and he was always thinking several moves ahead, which is why he cultivated a network of corrupt law enforcement contacts, paying huge bribes to a few strategically placed NYPD officers and even an FBI agent, which provided him with a stream of priceless intelligence, allowing him to stay one step ahead of indictments, to be warned of wiretaps, and to know when his rivals were planning moves against him, giving him an almost supernatural aura of invincibility within the underworld. This inside information made him not just a killer, but a strategic weapon for the Lucchese family. He was often the one who identified and sanctioned threats before they could even materialize, acting as the family's chief of security and executioner, a role he performed with zealous dedication. It was during this period that he orchestrated the murder of Lucchese capo Johnny Sack Santimoro, whom he correctly suspected was cooperating with the government, a hit that further solidified his reputation for preemptive and flawless violence. Yet, for all his cunning and brutality, Casso was also a creature of paranoia, and the very power he wielded began to isolate him, forcing him to live like a ghost, moving between safe houses, constantly watching his back, trusting no one completely, not even his own underlings, as the pressure from the law and the internal politics of the Mafia created a constant, low-grade hum of existential threat that would have broken a lesser man but only seemed to sharpen Casso's instincts. He was a king in a kingdom of shadows, ruling through a combination of financial might, strategic intelligence, and the ever-present threat of horrifying violence, a man at the peak of his power, yet standing on a foundation that was growing increasingly unstable, a foundation that began to crack irreparably with the election of Vittorio Vic Amuso as the new boss of the Lucchese family, a man whom Casso had grown up with and considered a close ally, leading to Casso's own appointment as underboss, the second in command, placing him in the inner sanctum of power but also chaining his fate directly to the increasingly erratic and paranoid Amuso. This partnership, which should have been the crowning achievement of his criminal career, would instead become the engine of his destruction, as the two men, gripped by a fever of suspicion, embarked on a reign of terror within their own family, ordering a bloody purge of anyone they even vaguely suspected of disloyalty, turning the Lucchese family from a disciplined criminal corporation into a slaughterhouse where made men were killed on the flimsiest of whispers, a strategy that created an atmosphere of pure terror but also sowed the seeds of widespread resentment and fear that would soon bear the bitter fruit of betrayal. The ascent to the pinnacle of power within the Lucchese crime family for Anthony Casso, now the official underboss, should have been a time of consolidating his empire and enjoying the fruits of a lifetime of violence and cunning. But instead it marked the beginning of a frantic, bloody, and paranoid chapter where the very methods that had propelled him to the top, ruthless preemption and absolute brutality, began to corrode the foundation of his authority from within, a slow-burning fuse that would eventually ignite an inferno of betrayal. His partnership with the new boss, Vic Amuso, quickly evolved into a joint dictatorship of fear, where the two men, isolated in their power and increasingly suspicious of everyone around them, began to see traitors in every shadow and hearsay as confirmed fact, leading to a murderous purge within their own ranks that would become infamous as the Lucchese family wars, a period of internal carnage that destabilized the entire organization. The first and most significant crack in their united front appeared with the case of Pete Chiodo, a massive, high-earning capo who was instrumental in running the family's lucrative operations in Staten Island, but who had made the fatal mistake of crossing Casso in a business dispute and, more critically, was viewed as a potential rival for power, a sin for which there was only one punishment in Casso's world. When Chiodo was indicted on federal racketeering charges, Casso and Amuso, convinced he would break the sacred oath of omertà and become a government witness, immediately issued a contract on his life, a decision that demonstrated their zero-tolerance policy for any perceived weakness but also showcased a reckless disregard for the value of a top earner. The hit was attempted in a brazen daytime ambush as Chiodo was driving, gunmen unleashing a hail of bullets that struck him 12 times, yet miraculously, the burly gangster survived, a turn of events that only confirmed Casso's worst fears and sealed Chiodo's fate, pushing the wounded man directly into the arms of the waiting FBI, where he did indeed become a cooperating witness, providing a treasure trove of information that detailed countless murders, racketeering acts, and, most damningly, the direct orders from Casso and Amuso. The survival of Chiodo was a catastrophic intelligence breach for the Lucchese administration, but instead of prompting a strategic retreat or a change in tactics, it sent Casso and Amuso spiraling deeper into their paranoia, leading to a series of even more rash and violent decisions, including the sanctioning of the murder of a beloved and powerful Gambino family capo, Thomas "Tommy" Sparrow Spio, over a relatively minor dispute, a move that risked a devastating war between the families and alienated their few remaining allies, including Sammy Gravano, who saw the killing as an unnecessary and dangerous escalation. Casso's world was shrinking rapidly. The once vast and powerful network of associates was now a small, tight circle of trusted killers, and the list of sanctioned hits grew longer each day, targeting not only suspected informants but also their own family members, as in the case of ordering the murder of a gangster's daughter simply because she might have overheard a sensitive conversation, a level of brutality that shocked even the most hardened mafiosi. This reign of terror was unsustainable, and the pressure from both the federal government, now armed with Chiodo's testimony, and the growing mutiny within their own family, forced Casso and Amuso to flee New York and go into hiding, becoming fugitives running their crumbling empire from a series of anonymous motel rooms, communicating through burned phones and intermediaries, a far cry from the power and glory of their heyday. It was during this period on the run that Casso's legendary cunning began to fray, his decisions becoming more erratic and desperate. He authorized the murder of a former associate, James "Jimmy" Hidell, in a particularly gruesome fashion, believing Hidell had been involved in a previous botched attempt on his life, and then, in an act of breathtaking audacity, he arranged for the body to be delivered to the Gambino family's John Gotti as a twisted gift, a move that was meant to solidify an alliance but instead further showcased his destabilizing volatility. The net, however, was closing inexorably. The FBI, aided by a growing chorus of turncoats from within the Lucchese ranks who could no longer tolerate the psychotic whims of their leaders, finally tracked down and arrested Vic Amuso in a Scranton, Pennsylvania apartment in 1991, leaving Anthony Casso alone, the last king of a ruined kingdom, now the sole target of a massive nationwide manhunt. For months, Casso managed to evade capture, moving between safe houses, relying on his deep network of corrupt contacts, including his prized NYPD detective, to stay ahead of the pursuit, but his own hyper-aggressive nature proved to be his undoing. A simple phone call to a former associate to arrange a meeting was intercepted, and on a cold January morning in 1993, FBI agents stormed a house in Mount Olive, New Jersey, and found Anthony Gaspipe Casso, unarmed and unprepared, finally bringing his violent, decades-long reign to an end. His arrest was celebrated as a major victory for law enforcement, but they had no idea that the most damaging chapter of the Anthony Casso story was yet to be written, that the man they had just caged, a man who had lived his entire life by the sword, would now attempt to save his own skin by breaking the one rule he had once sworn to die for, setting the stage for a betrayal so profound it would become a permanent stain on the history of La Cosa Nostra. The capture of Anthony Casso did not bring the story to a close. Instead, it opened a new and even more treacherous chapter, one where the man who had enforced the Mafia's code of silence with unimaginable brutality would become its most infamous and voluble violator. A transformation that began not with immediate confession but with a calculated, strategic decision born of a lifetime of self-preservation. Initially, Casso adopted a posture of defiance, facing a staggering 71-count indictment that included 14 murders, racketeering, extortion, and a litany of other charges that guaranteed he would die in prison if convicted, a reality he understood with cold clarity. Yet he believed he still held cards to play. Primarily his extensive knowledge of corrupt law enforcement officials who had been on his payroll for years, information he planned to use as a bargaining chip. He entered into a cooperation agreement with the federal government in 1994, a move that sent shockwaves through the underworld and the justice system alike. For Casso wasn't just any gangster. He was a former underboss, a keeper of the darkest secrets, a man who had been in the room when countless murders were ordered and who had personal relationships with the bosses of all 5 families. For the next several years, Casso became a prolific fountain of information for the FBI, providing detailed accounts of over a dozen murders, both solved and unsolved, unraveling complex criminal enterprises, and identifying the hidden hands behind some of New York's most notorious crimes, including confirming the involvement of Lucchese family boss Vic Amuso in the conspiracy to kill John Gotti, which led to additional charges against his former partner. His cooperation was, in its own dark way, a masterpiece of criminal recollection. He provided chillingly detailed narratives of killings, from the 1986 murder of NYPD officer Peter Calabro, which he now confessed to ordering, to the brutal slaying of Lucchese capo John Santimoro, and the attempted hit on Pete Chiodo, painting a comprehensive and horrifying picture of the Mafia's inner workings during its most violent era. But the crown jewel of his testimony, the aspect that promised the most significant institutional impact, was his detailed identification of corrupt law enforcement figures, including his allegations against an FBI agent, Lindley DeVecchio, whom Casso claimed had been on his payroll, providing him with sensitive information that allowed him to evade arrest and eliminate rivals. A bombshell accusation that threatened to cripple the FBI's organized crime division and expose a deep, systemic rot. However, the very traits that made Casso a formidable criminal, his cunning, his manipulative nature, and his profound sense of entitlement, began to undermine his credibility as a witness. He was caught lying to prosecutors about certain crimes, he attempted to smuggle messages out of prison, and he was implicated in a scheme to arrange an attack on a fellow inmate, all of which painted a picture of a man who was incapable of playing by anyone's rules but his own. The government, initially eager to leverage his unparalleled knowledge, grew increasingly frustrated with his duplicity and his refusal to fully adhere to the terms of his cooperation agreement. They saw that he was not a repentant man seeking redemption, but a cornered predator still trying to manipulate the system to his advantage, using his testimony not to atone but to continue his personal wars from within the witness protection program. The final straw came when prosecutors discovered he had withheld information about several murders and had been less than truthful about his own role in certain criminal acts, leading them to the inescapable conclusion that Anthony Casso was, fundamentally, an unreliable and pathological liar whose testimony was too tainted to be presented to a jury, a realization that forced them to take the nearly unprecedented step of voiding his cooperation agreement in 1998. This decision was a catastrophic blow to Casso. It meant the protective cloak of the witness protection program was ripped away, all the murder charges he had avoided through his deal were reinstated, and he was thrown back into the general prison population, now wearing the dual labels of rat and liar, making him a target for every mafioso he had implicated and isolating him completely from both the world he betrayed and the system that had rejected him. His subsequent sentencing was a formality that sealed his fate. A federal judge, condemning his endless duplicity and the sheer scope of his crimes, handed down 13 consecutive life sentences, ensuring that Anthony Gaspipe Casso would spend every remaining second of his life in a cold, concrete cell, a fitting end for a man who had valued his freedom and power above all else. The final years of his life were spent in the most restrictive confines of the American prison system, largely at the ADX Florence Supermax facility in Colorado, a place designed to break the human spirit, where he was confined to a small cell for 23 hours a day, with no contact with other notorious inmates, no view of the outside world, and no hope of ever leaving. A solitary existence that stood in stark contrast to the vibrant, violent, and powerful life he had once commanded on the streets of New York. He became a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered in the annals of organized crime, a man whose insatiable appetite for violence and power had led him to the one place he could not dominate, control, or escape, dying of cancer in 2020 at the age of 78. Not in a blaze of glory but in anonymous custody, his death marking the final, quiet punctuation to a story that had been written in screams and gunfire. A story that serves as a stark reminder that in the treacherous world of the Mafia, the most dangerous enemy is often the monster a family creates within its own ranks. The legacy of Anthony Gaspipe Casso is a complex and dark tapestry woven with threads of unparalleled violence, shrewd criminal strategy, and ultimate, self-inflicted ruin. A legacy that serves as a critical case study in the inherent contradictions and fatal flaws of the Mafia's romanticized mythology, forcing us to look beyond the Hollywood glamour and confront the raw, psychopathic reality that festered at its core. To understand Casso's impact is to understand how he weaponized the very concept of omertà, not as a sacred oath of silence but as a tool for his own advancement and a justification for his purges, perverting the code into a license to kill anyone he deemed a potential threat, thereby exposing the code's fragility when faced with a man who recognized no authority but his own will. His story is not one of a noble outlaw but of a predatory force of nature who happened to find his perfect habitat within the structure of the Lucchese crime family, an organization that initially rewarded his particular talents but ultimately proved too small to contain his boundless avarice and paranoia. The long-term consequences of his reign and subsequent betrayal were profound and far-reaching, effectively crippling the Lucchese family for a generation. The internal trust, already a scarce commodity in the underworld, was utterly evaporated by his and Amuso's bloody purges, leaving behind a landscape of fear and suspicion where every member looked at his brother with sideways glances, wondering if he would be the next name on a secret list. This internal decay was compounded exponentially by his decision to cooperate. While his testimony was ultimately deemed too tainted for court, the mere act of his turning, coupled with the earlier defections of Sammy Gravano and Pete Chiodo, shattered the invincible image of the Mafia's top echelon, proving to every soldier on the street that even the most hardened underboss, when faced with the certainty of dying in a cage, could choose to talk, a psychological blow from which the traditional 5 families would never fully recover. His allegations of widespread corruption within the FBI, particularly against Agent Lynn DeVecchio, though never conclusively proven in a way that satisfied a court of law, created a permanent stain on the Bureau's organized crime units, fueling decades of speculation, internal investigations, and a lingering cloud of doubt over some of their biggest victories, and forcing a painful institutional self-examination about the methods used to infiltrate these secret societies and the moral compromises made along the way. For historians and true crime aficionados, Casso remains a figure of grim fascination precisely because he represents the logical, terrifying endpoint of a life lived entirely without restraint. He was the embodiment of the ID, a man whose every impulse, from ambition to rage, was acted upon immediately and with extreme prejudice, making him a compelling subject for study but a catastrophic leader for a criminal enterprise that required at least a facade of stability and long-term planning. In the end, his life poses a disturbing question about the nature of evil and the systems that enable it. Was Anthony Casso a monster created by the violent, insular world of the Mafia, or was the Mafia merely the arena in which a pre-existing monster was allowed to flourish and reach its full, devastating potential? The evidence suggests the latter, that Casso's psychopathy was innate, and the structure of organized crime provided him with a ready-made justification for his violence, a hierarchy to climb, and a stream of victims to target. His final years in the sensory deprivation of ADX Florence were a kind of poetic justice, a life defined by intense action, sound, and fury culminating in an existence of profound silence and stifling isolation, a forced introspection that one can only imagine was a torture far greater than any physical pain for a man of his temperament. He became a non-person, erased from the world he once terrorized, his name a curse and his story a lesson in the futility of his chosen path. The American Mafia, as it existed in the mid-20th century, is largely a ghost now, its power broken by RICO statutes and a relentless parade of turncoats, and no single individual exemplifies the reasons for its collapse more than Anthony Casso. Not because of the outside pressure from law enforcement, but because of the internal rot he both represented and accelerated. His journey from the streets of Bensonhurst to a supermax coffin is the ultimate refutation of the gangster's dream. A stark narrative that illustrates how the pursuit of absolute power through violence does not lead to respect and legacy, but to betrayal, isolation, and a name that is remembered not with reverence, but with a shudder. The story of Gaspipe is therefore not just a biography of a killer. It is a morality play written in blood, a warning etched into the historical record about the self-consuming nature of treachery and the empty promise of a life lived outside the law, a life that inevitably concludes not with freedom and power, but with the cold, impersonal click of a prison door locking forever. To truly grasp the depth of the shadow Anthony Casso cast, one must venture beyond the cold facts of his crimes and delve into the psychological wreckage he left in his wake. The human cost that extends far beyond the official body count, touching the lives of victims' families who received no justice from his cooperation, the former associates living in perpetual fear, and the very soul of the neighborhoods he once ruled through a combination of calculated generosity and sheer terror. Consider the silent, grief-stricken world of the families of those he murdered, like the family of NYPD officer Peter Calabro, a man who was simply doing his duty, trying to stem the tide of drugs flooding his city, only to be executed on the orders of a man who considered himself above any law, a murder for which Casso ultimately faced no direct legal consequence due to his botched cooperation deal, leaving a wound that can never truly heal and a fundamental question of how a system that prides itself on justice can allow such a pivotal admission to ultimately count for nothing in a court of law. Think of the shattered lives within the Mafia itself, not out of sympathy for the criminals, but as a testament to Casso's scorched earth approach to leadership. Men who had spent their entire lives in the organization saw their sons, their brothers, their childhood friends, marked for death on the whim of a paranoid underboss, their murders ordered not for clear transgressions but for vague suspicions, tearing apart the very social fabric of their insular communities and proving that the supposed honor among thieves was a lethal fiction perpetuated by men like Casso for their own convenience. His betrayal in becoming a government witness added a final, bitter layer to this trauma, as the families of those he had killed now had to bear the additional insult of seeing their loved one's murder attempt to barter their stories for his own freedom, reducing their lives and deaths to mere negotiating chips in a cynical game played between a killer and the state, a profound violation that cheapened their memory and mocked the concept of closure. Beyond the immediate circle of violence, Casso's operations, particularly his stranglehold on the hijacking rackets at JFK Airport, had a ripple effect that impacted the entire regional economy, driving up insurance costs for businesses, inflating prices for consumers, and creating an atmosphere of lawlessness that discouraged legitimate investment in the areas under his control. A hidden tax of fear and corruption paid by everyday people who never knew his name but felt the consequences of his actions in their daily lives. His foray into large-scale narcotics trafficking, which he pursued with characteristic ambition despite the Mafia's official ban, poisoned countless communities, fueling addiction, street crime, and violence in neighborhoods far removed from his own Bensonhurst roots, a legacy of human despair and broken families that continues to resonate through generations. A chain of suffering he set in motion for pure profit without a moment's hesitation or a shred of remorse. Even his own family, his wife Lillian and their children, became unwilling prisoners of his double life, forced to live behind a facade of normalcy while knowing the terrible truth of the man they called husband and father, and then ultimately forced to confront the horrifying public revelation of his countless murders and his status as a cooperator, bearing the shame and the danger that came with his infamy. Their lives forever defined by the monstrous actions of a man they had loved. The psychological portrait of Casso that emerges from the collective testimony of those who knew him is that of a man devoid of empathy, a true psychopath who viewed every human relationship through a lens of utility, where people were either assets to be used or obstacles to be removed, a worldview that allowed him to order a murder in the morning and sit down to a family dinner in the evening without the slightest flicker of cognitive dissonance. This chilling lack of humanity is what made him such an effective and feared killer, but it is also what guaranteed his ultimate failure, for a system, even a criminal one, cannot long be governed by pure, unadulterated psychosis. It requires at least a minimal level of trust, predictability, and long-term vision, all of which Casso sacrificed at the altar of his immediate impulses and paranoias. His life stands as a dark monument to the idea that absolute power does not corrupt absolutely. Rather, it reveals the true nature of the individual wielding it, and in Casso's case, It revealed a bottomless pit of avarice and violence that no amount of money, power, or blood could ever fill. The story of his downfall, therefore, is not a tragedy but an inevitability. The predictable collapse of a house built on a foundation of sand and shattered bones. A warning that resonates far beyond the world of organized crime and into any sphere where power is concentrated in the hands of those who lack a moral compass. To study Anthony Casso is to stare into the abyss of a conscience completely untethered from the moorings of empathy and consequence, and to understand that while such a force can wreak immense havoc for a time, its own internal contradictions and the fundamental need for order, even in the underworld, will always conspire to bring it down, leaving behind only a trail of tears, a stack of unresolved cases, and a name that history remembers not for its power, but for the profound and utter desolation it left in its wake. The intricate and deeply symbiotic, yet ultimately parasitic, relationship between Anthony Casso and the Lucchese crime family represents a fascinating case study in how a criminal organization can simultaneously cultivate and be consumed by its own most destructive element, a dynamic that began with mutual benefit but spiraled into a self-devouring frenzy that left the family a hollowed-out shell of its former self. When Casso first ascended through the ranks, he was viewed as the ideal modern gangster, a prolific earner who mastered the complex and lucrative art of airport hijacking, a feared and effective enforcer whose mere involvement in a dispute could ensure compliance without a single shot being fired, and a loyal soldier with impeccable lineage, the son of a made man who understood the culture and the rules from birth. For the Lucchese family, Casso was a valuable asset, a multi-tool of crime who could generate immense revenue while also serving as the organization's sharpest weapon, a man whose reputation for violence provided a protective shield for the family's more delicate political and labor racketeering operations, intimidating rivals and ensuring that the family's interests were never challenged without severe consequence. His promotion to underboss alongside Vic Amuso was initially seen as a logical reward for his decades of service and a strategic move to place two formidable, street-smart leaders at the helm, men who could protect the family's interests in a rapidly changing underworld where the old ways were being challenged by aggressive new federal laws and the rise of other ethnic crime groups. However, this was the critical turning point, the moment the parasite began to overwhelm the host. For the very qualities that made Casso an excellent soldier, his paranoia, his quick trigger finger, his belief that every problem could be solved with overwhelming force, made him a catastrophic administrator, as he and Amuso failed to understand the fundamental difference between managing a criminal enterprise and simply terrorizing it into submission. The internal purge they initiated was not a strategic culling of verifiable traitors, but a spasmodic, reactive campaign of violence based on rumor, hearsay, and their own escalating fears, effectively decapitating the family's middle management by eliminating some of its most experienced and capable earners, the very men who kept the money flowing and the operations running smoothly day to day. This created a power vacuum and a climate of such intense dread that initiative and ambition, the lifeblood of any criminal organization, was stifled completely, as capos and soldiers became more focused on their own survival than on generating revenue, leading to a sharp decline in the family's financial health and operational effectiveness. The decision to go on the run further accelerated this decay, as Casso and Amuso attempted to micromanage a sprawling criminal empire from payphones and motel rooms, issuing erratic and often nonsensical orders that confused and alienated their remaining captains, who were left to handle the increasing pressure from law enforcement with diminishing resources and support from their absent and seemingly unhinged leadership. When Casso finally made the historic decision to break his oath and cooperate, he delivered the coup de grace to the Lucchese family's stability. His testimony, even with its later recriminations and proven falsehoods, provided the federal government with an unprecedented and detailed roadmap to the family's inner workings, its hidden sources of income, its secret meeting places, and its remaining leadership structure, enabling a wave of indictments that scooped up anyone who had managed to survive the initial internal purges. The long-term legacy of Casso's reign for the Lucchese family was one of institutional ruin from which it would never truly recover. It lost its position as a peer and powerful rival to the other four families, becoming a weakened, secondary player in the New York underworld, perpetually struggling to rebuild its ranks and its reputation, all while being haunted by the ghost of the underboss who had first gutted it from within and then sold its secrets to the government for a chance at a freedom he would never obtain. The story of Casso and the Luccheses is therefore a stark lesson in the limits of brute force as a management strategy and the inherent vulnerability of secret societies to the treachery of their own members, proving that no organization, no matter how powerful or feared, is immune to the corrosive effects of paranoia and the existential threat posed by a key insider who ultimately values his own skin above the survival of the entire enterprise. The Lucchese crime family, once a pillar of the American Mafia, became a living testament to the fact that the most dangerous enemy is not always the one with the badge on the outside, but the one with a knife on the inside, a knife wielded by a man like Anthony Casso, who was willing to carve out the heart of the very family that had given him power, purpose, and a legacy, all in a futile attempt to save himself from the inevitable consequences of the very life he had so ruthlessly and passionately chosen to live. The operational methodology of Anthony Casso, the intricate and coldly efficient system he developed for conducting his criminal affairs, offers a chilling blueprint of a mind that viewed the world as a complex chessboard of threats and opportunities, where every human being was a piece to be manipulated, neutralized, or sacrificed for his own advancement. A philosophy he implemented with a discipline that bordered on the artistic in its meticulous attention to the macabre details of violence and betrayal. At the core of his strategy was the principle of preemptive action, a belief that the most effective way to deal with a potential problem was to eliminate it long before it could fully form, a doctrine he applied with ruthless consistency, sanctioning murders based on the faintest whisper of dissent, a stray comment interpreted as disrespect, or the mere suspicion that an individual might be considering cooperation with law enforcement. This was not the reactive violence of a hot-headed thug, it was the calculated, strategic culling of a master gardener pruning a hedge, except the branches he cut were human lives, and he did so with the cold, detached precision of a surgeon, ensuring the overall health and security of his own position within the organism of the Lucchese family. His network of corrupt law enforcement officials was not a luxury or a mere convenience for him. It was the central nervous system of his entire operation, an early warning radar that gave him a seemingly supernatural ability to anticipate the moves of his enemies, both within the law and within the Mafia, allowing him to vanish moments before an FBI raid or to learn of a rival's plot against him while it was still in its planning stages. This intelligence apparatus made him not just a dangerous individual, but a strategic asset of immense value to the family, a human supercomputer who could process threats and neutralize them with stunning speed and efficiency, a capability that made his fellow mafiosi both deeply reliant on him and profoundly terrified of him, for they knew that if they ever inadvertently became a blip on his radar, their fate was all but sealed. His approach to murder was itself a study in psychological warfare. He understood that the manner of a killing could send a more powerful message than the act itself, which is why he orchestrated deaths that were particularly brutal or symbolic, such as the murder of Jimmy Hidell, which served as a gruesome gift to John Gotti, a message written in blood and suffering that was meant to solidify an alliance through shared complicity in a horrific act. He mastered the art of the double life, maintaining his facade as a devoted family man in a well-appointed home, all while directing a sprawling empire of hijacking, narcotics, and murder from payphones and anonymous social clubs. A psychological partitioning that allowed him to compartmentalize his existence so completely that the man who kissed his children goodnight could, hours later, calmly order the execution of a former friend without a flicker of emotion. His financial operations were run with the acumen of a Fortune 500 CEO, diversifying his streams of income from the traditional pillars of loan sharking and gambling to the high-stakes worlds of airport hijacking and, most lucratively, heroin trafficking, reinvesting his profits into bribes, weapons, and his own luxurious lifestyle, while always ensuring a steady flow of cash upward to the family administration to keep them content and reliant on his capabilities. This cold, systematic approach is what made his eventual cooperation with the government so uniquely damaging. When he decided to talk, he did not simply offer up a few names and dates, he provided the FBI with a comprehensive, encyclopedic breakdown of his entire operational playbook, explaining not just the who and the what of his crimes, but the how and the why, laying bare the strategic thinking, the corrupt networks, and the murderous logic that had governed his rise to power. He gave them a masterclass in modern mob strategy, taught by its most ruthless and successful practitioner, a seminar that undoubtedly shaped the FBI's own tactics for years to come in their fight against organized crime. Yet, the very nature of this brilliant criminal mind, its inherent deceitfulness and manipulative core, is also what led to the collapse of his cooperation. He could not help but play his own games, lying about certain events, attempting to use his protected status to settle old scores, and withholding information he deemed too valuable to give away for free, proving that even when his life depended on it, he was incapable of true cooperation, incapable of submitting to any authority other than his own cunning. His operational methodology, for all its brilliance in the underworld, was fundamentally incompatible with the rules-based system of the justice system, and his attempt to transfer his skills from one arena to the other was a catastrophic failure, revealing the ultimate limitation of his genius. It could only function in a world of shadows and corruption, and when exposed to the dispassionate, procedure-driven light of the law, It withered and collapsed, leaving him with nothing but the cold, hard reality of 13 consecutive life sentences, a final, definitive checkmate on the grand chessboard he believed he alone controlled. The story of Anthony Casso's methods is therefore a tale of two systems colliding, the fluid, immoral, and brutal system of a criminal mastermind meeting the rigid, rule-bound, and ultimately more powerful system of the state, and in that collision, the brilliant but flawed methodology of the predator was systematically dismantled and rendered obsolete, proving that no amount of street-level cunning can ultimately triumph over the relentless, grinding machinery of established law. The psychological portrait of Anthony Casso that emerges from the countless hours of testimony, FBI profiles, and the chillingly calm recollections of his own crimes is that of a textbook psychopath, a man whose brain was wired without the capacity for empathy, remorse, or genuine human connection, allowing him to navigate a world of extreme violence and betrayal with a serene and focused detachment that made him uniquely suited for his chosen profession but ultimately incapable of sustaining the very alliances his power depended upon. Psychopathy, as defined by clinical standards, is characterized by a cluster of traits including a grandiose sense of self-worth, a pathological need for stimulation, cunning and manipulativeness, and a profound lack of empathy or guilt, a checklist that reads like a biography of Anthony Casso, who from his earliest days displayed an almost preternatural comfort with violence, treating it not as a necessary evil but as the most efficient and satisfying solution to the problems that stood in his path. His ability to compartmentalize his life was not a skill he learned but an inherent feature of his psyche. He could orchestrate a brutal, close-range murder in the afternoon and then return home to his wife and children for a family dinner, engaging in the mundane rituals of domestic life without any apparent psychological distress or emotional carryover. A clear indication that the part of the brain responsible for connecting actions to moral consequences was simply absent or non-functional in him. This lack of a moral compass was his greatest asset in the underworld, allowing him to make decisions that other, more emotionally complex mafiosi might hesitate over. Decisions like ordering the murder of a police officer or sanctioning the death of a fellow mobster's family member. Acts that went against even the Mafia's own twisted code, but which Casso could authorize with cold-blooded logic because he viewed every human life through a lens of pure utility. His famous charm and persuasiveness, noted by many who met him in social settings, were not genuine personality traits but the calculated tools of a master manipulator, a superficial glibness he could deploy to disarm potential victims, negotiate business deals, or cultivate corrupt law enforcement contacts, all while secretly viewing the people he charmed as pawns in a grand, self-serving game. This profound manipulativeness is precisely what doomed his cooperation with the federal government. He approached the process of providing testimony not as an act of contrition or even simple deal-making, but as another criminal enterprise to be managed, another system to be gamed, believing he could outsmart the prosecutors, withhold crucial information, and use his insider knowledge to manipulate the justice system just as he had manipulated the underworld, a catastrophic miscalculation that revealed his inability to ever operate in good faith. His paranoia, which escalated to psychotic proportions during his reign as underboss, was not a sign of a conscience awakening but rather the logical outcome of a psychopathic mind understanding that everyone else was ultimately as treacherous and self-serving as he was, leading him to see threats in every corner because he knew, based on his own internal blueprint, that betrayal was the natural order of things. The grandiose sense of self-worth, another hallmark of his condition, is evident in his belief that he could single-handedly purge the Lucchese family of its perceived weaknesses, his audacious attempt to gift-wrap a murder for John Gotti, and his ultimate conviction that his knowledge was so valuable the government would allow him to repeatedly violate the terms of his cooperation agreement, a towering arrogance that blinded him to the reality that he was not the smartest man in every room, especially when that room was a federal courtroom. This psychological framework explains the central paradox of his life. How a man so brilliantly adept at the tactics of survival and accumulation of power could be so strategically foolish as to destroy the organization that gave him power and then sabotage his only chance to avoid dying in prison. He was a master of the immediate move, the short-term checkmate, but he was psychologically incapable of the long-term strategic planning required for true, sustainable leadership, because such planning requires a level of trust and a vision for a future beyond one's own immediate desires, concepts that are alien to the psychopathic mind. His life, therefore, stands as a stark clinical study in the real-world application of psychopathy, a demonstration of how these traits can lead to rapid ascent in environments that reward ruthlessness and deception, but also how they contain the seeds of their own inevitable destruction, ensuring that a life lived without a moral center, without empathy, and without the ability to form genuine bonds, is ultimately a life condemned to isolation, betrayal, and a profound, echoing emptiness. Anthony Casso was not a tragic figure brought down by a single flaw. He was a machine of predation that was built without an off switch, a machine that eventually, predictably, consumed itself because it could not do otherwise, running its destructive program until the only thing left was the silent, solitary confinement of a supermax cell, a final state of being that was, for a man of his temperament, the most exquisite and fitting torture imaginable. The complex and ultimately destructive relationship between Anthony Casso and the federal justice system represents a years-long dance of mutual manipulation. A high-stakes game where both sides believed they were using the other for their own ends. A confrontation that began with the FBI's dogged pursuit of a ghost-like criminal mastermind and culminated in the unprecedented spectacle of that same mastermind attempting to deconstruct the very institution that had captured him, only to be outmaneuvered by the relentless, procedural machinery of the law. For years, Casso was the elusive phantom, a name on wiretaps and a shadow in surveillance photos. A criminal who seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to anticipate the Bureau's moves, vanishing from safe houses hours before raids were executed and avoiding tapped phones with an instinct that baffled agents, creating an aura of invincibility that made his capture one of the top priorities for the organized crime task force in New York. This early phase of the relationship was defined by Casso's clear upper hand, as he leveraged his network of corrupt insiders to stay perpetually one step ahead, turning the vast resources of the FBI into a clumsy, predictable opponent that he could mock and evade from the shadows, a fact that undoubtedly fed his immense ego and reinforced his belief in his own intellectual superiority over any system of authority. His eventual arrest in 1993 was therefore not just a legal victory but a psychological one for the government. The moment they finally laid hands on the legend and proved that his invincibility was a carefully maintained illusion. Yet the moment he was in custody, the dynamic shifted into a new and even more complex phase, as the hunters now had to deal with the captured predator who still possessed his most dangerous weapon, the vast, encyclopedic knowledge locked inside his mind. The decision to cooperate was, from Casso's perspective, not a surrender but a strategic pivot, a move to a new battlefield where he could use his intelligence as a currency to buy back his freedom. And he began his debriefings with the same methodical precision he applied to his criminal operations, providing prosecutors with a fire hose of information that solved cold cases, exposed hidden corruptions, and detailed murders with a clinical detachment that both impressed and horrified the agents. Listening to him. For the government, this was an intelligence windfall of historic proportions, a chance to look directly into the inner workings of the Mafia at its most violent and to potentially root out the corrupt cancer within their own ranks. And they initially embraced Casso as their star witness, placing him in the witness protection program and using his information to build airtight cases against his former associates, including his own boss, Vic Amuso. However, the relationship quickly began to sour as the fundamental incompatibility between Casso's psychopathic nature and the government's need for veracity and good faith became apparent. He was caught in a series of lies, he attempted to orchestrate crimes from within prison, and he withheld critical information, proving to prosecutors that he was not a reformed man seeking redemption but a consummate manipulator playing a new, more desperate angle for his own benefit. The government's voiding of his cooperation agreement in 1998 was a monumental moment, a rare and stunning declaration that they would rather forfeit his testimony entirely than continue to be party to his endless deceptions. A decision that spoke volumes about their assessment of his character and the absolute non-negotiable requirement for truth in the judicial process, no matter how valuable the source might otherwise appear. This action effectively ended the second phase of their relationship and began the final, punitive phase, where the system that had once sought his knowledge now focused solely on delivering the full, unmitigated force of its punishment, reinstating all the murder charges and ensuring he would die in prison, a fate they made as harsh as possible by consigning him to the sensory deprivation of a supermax facility. The aftermath of this failed cooperation left a tangled legacy for the justice system. On one hand, it demonstrated a powerful principle of integrity, showing that the government would not be held hostage by a liar, even one with so much to offer, but on the other hand, it left numerous victims' families without the courtroom closure his official testimony might have provided and created a lingering cloud of suspicion over the explosive corruption allegations he had made, which were never fully litigated in a public forum. In the final analysis, the relationship between Anthony Casso and the federal government proves that while a system built on rules and procedure may at times be outmaneuvered by a brilliant, lawless individual in the short term, it ultimately possesses a staying power and a foundational integrity that a personality built on lies and manipulation can never overcome. Casso's entire life was a testament to the power of the individual will, but his final decades were a testament to the power of the collective, institutional will of a society that had finally had enough of his violence and his deceit, a society that patiently, methodically, and permanently removed him from its midst, proving that no single man, no matter how cunning or ruthless, is stronger than the determined will of the law. His story serves as a permanent case file in the annals of justice, a reminder of the complexities and moral hazards of dealing with the devil, but also a reaffirmation that in the long run, the system, for all its flaws, is designed to withstand the assaults of those who believe that rules are for other people, and that in the end, the cold, hard steel of the prison door will always slam shut louder than the most seductive and self-serving lies. The final, bleak chapter of Anthony Casso's life, the nearly 2 decades he spent incarcerated within the most punishing prisons the American government could devise, represents a profound and deliberate form of existential nullification, a systematic dismantling of a man who had defined himself entirely through action, power, and sensory engagement with the world, reducing his existence to a sterile, monotonous routine within a concrete box where the only thing left to dominate was the memory of his own past. His initial entry into the federal prison system was likely met with the same calculating defiance that had characterized his entire life, a belief that even within the confines of a correctional facility, his intelligence and reputation would allow him to exert some measure of influence, to command respect, and to perhaps even continue managing his affairs from behind the walls. But the government was acutely aware of who they were housing, and they were determined to make an example of him, ensuring his transfer into the administrative maximum facility in Florence, Colorado, a place colloquially and ominously known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, a prison specifically designed to hold the most disruptive and dangerous inmates in the entire federal system. Life at ADX Florence is an exercise in sensory and social deprivation so complete it borders on psychological warfare. Inmates are housed in a concrete cell for 23 hours a day, with a single hour of recreation in a small, enclosed, outdoor cage reminiscent of a dog run. All human contact is mediated through steel doors and electronic systems. The view from the narrow slit of a window is deliberately obscured, and the constant, humming artificial light bleeds all sense of day and night into a perpetual, soul-deadening twilight. For a man like Casso, whose identity was forged in the vibrant, chaotic, and visceral streets of Brooklyn, whose power was exercised through face-to-face intimidation and the whispered word in a social club, this environment was a custom-made hell, a void where his famed cunning had no purchase, his charm was useless, and his capacity for violence was met with an absolute, unassailable counterforce of concrete and steel. He was placed in a universe where his reputation as Gaspipe meant nothing, where the guards who controlled his every movement were faceless, rotating figures behind plexiglass, utterly immune to his threats or his manipulations, and where the only other inmates were the most notorious terrorists, spies, and drug lords, men who were locked in their own identical cells, each one a king of nothing, ruling over a domain of 4 walls and a steel toilet. This was not merely imprisonment, it was a form of civil death, a deliberate erasure from the world of men, a forced introspection that for a psychopath devoid of genuine inner life, would have been a torture far more exquisite than any physical pain, a constant, gnawing confrontation with the absolute emptiness at his core, an emptiness he had spent a lifetime trying to fill with money, blood, and power. The years in this supermax tomb would have stretched on in an unbearable monotony, a cycle of meals delivered through a slot in the door, the lonely hour in the concrete recreation cage, and the endless, silent hours alone with the ghosts of the men he had murdered, ghosts that surely haunted not with guilt, for he was incapable of it, but with the bitter irony of his own impotence, a living reminder that all his schemes and all his violence had led him to this single, inescapable point, a silent, solitary cell. He became a non-person, his name slowly fading from the headlines, his story becoming a footnote in the history of organized crime, his physical health undoubtedly deteriorating from the lack of movement, the poor nutrition, and the immense psychological stress of such profound isolation, a slow decay that mirrored the decay of the Mafia itself, an institution he had helped to cripple from within. His death from cancer in December of 2020 was the final, quiet punctuation to this long sentence of nullification. He did not die in a shootout, he was not murdered by a rival, he simply succumbed to a disease in a prison infirmary, his passing noted in a brief news article that served as a final, public confirmation of his utter and complete defeat. There was no grand funeral, no procession of black cars filled with grieving mafiosi, only the state disposing of his body, the final administrative task in the long, cold case of Anthony Casso. His legacy, in these final years, was stripped bare of all the romanticized mythology of the gangster. There was no honor, no loyalty, no glamour, only the stark, clinical reality of a man who had chosen a path of predation and, upon being captured, was placed in a cage designed to extinguish the very predatory spirit that had defined him. The story of his incarceration is therefore the most important moral of his entire saga, a visual and visceral representation of the ultimate consequence of his life's choices, a demonstration that the universe, or at least the justice system, does possess a kind of karmic balance, and that for a life lived in the service of causing pain and fear, the most fitting retribution is not a dramatic execution, but the slow, meticulous, and soul-crushing imposition of nothingness. Anthony Casso's supermax existence was the living death that his countless victims never got to have, a long, slow, and lonely fade to black, a final proof that in the end, the system had not just beaten him, but it had erased him, leaving behind a story that serves not as a warning of his power, but as a chilling promise of the absolute price that must be paid for it. The cultural and historical footprint of Anthony Casso, the space he occupies in the broader narrative of American organized crime, extends far beyond the grim statistics of his body count and the cold facts of his criminal enterprises, placing him in a unique and darkly significant position as both the ultimate embodiment of the Mafia's operational peak and the living symbol of the internal rot that caused its precipitous decline, a complex legacy that continues to fascinate and horrify those who seek to understand the true nature of power without morality. In the pantheon of American mobsters, figures like Lucky Luciano are remembered as visionary architects, John Gotti as the flamboyant dapper Don who courted the media, and Henry Hill as the everyman informant who provided a street-level view. But Anthony Casso stands apart as the pure, unadulterated embodiment of the predator, a man whose entire existence was dedicated to the application of violent will, making him perhaps the most perfect and terrifying example of what the Mafia truly was at its core when stripped of all its self-aggrandizing mythology and romantic Hollywood veneer. His story serves as a crucial corrective to the popular culture narrative that often paints mob life with a brush of misguided honor and familial loyalty. Casso's career demonstrates with brutal clarity that the so-called code of omertà was a fragile fiction, a convenient myth that collapsed immediately when confronted with the pragmatic self-interest of a man who recognized no authority but his own, and his willingness to break that code so completely and voluminously helped shatter the image of the stoic, silent gangster for the entire world. Historically, his reign and downfall coincide perfectly with the end of the Mafia's golden age, a period in the late 1980s and early 1990s when the combined forces of the RICO Act, aggressive prosecution, and a cascading waterfall of high-profile cooperators like Sammy Gravano, and then Casso himself, finally broke the back of the five families. And his specific role in this collapse was not that of a passive victim but of an active accelerant, whose internal purges weakened the Lucchese family from within and whose subsequent betrayal encouraged a wave of other made men to follow his example and break their oaths. The sheer volume and detail of the information he provided, even if later tainted, gave federal prosecutors an unprecedented look into the day-to-day mechanics of a major crime family, from the specifics of airport hijackings to the intricate process of sanctioning a murder, creating a master template that would be used to dismantle criminal organizations for decades to come, making him, ironically, one of the most effective weapons the government ever wielded against the very world he sought to dominate. His life also forces a difficult conversation about the nature of psychopathy and its relationship to success in certain criminal environments, presenting a case study in how a complete lack of empathy, coupled with high intelligence, can be a powerful short-term advantage but a catastrophic long-term liability, as the same traits that allow for ruthless decision-making inevitably lead to isolation, paranoia, and the destruction of the necessary social networks that sustain any complex organization, be it legitimate or illicit. For the residents of New York City, his story is a dark thread in the fabric of the city's history, a reminder of a time when violence and corruption seeped into the very infrastructure of daily life, affecting the price of goods at the market, the safety of the streets, and the integrity of the institutions meant to protect the public, a shadow history that runs parallel to the more celebrated narrative of the city's revival. In the context of the Lucchese family itself, his name is a curse, a byword for treachery and unsustainable violence, a cautionary tale told to new recruits about the dangers of unfettered ambition and the importance of stability over flashy brutality, ensuring that his memory is kept alive not with reverence but as a lesson in what not to become. The ultimate irony of Anthony Casso's legacy is that the man who craved power, respect, and a fearsome reputation above all else ultimately achieved a form of historical immortality not for his strength, but for his weakness, not for his loyalty, but for his betrayal, and not for his silence, but for his endless, self-serving chatter. He wanted to be remembered as a king of the underworld, but history will remember him as the king who burned down his own castle and then sold the blueprints to the arson investigators. A figure of immense power who ultimately became a symbol of profound systemic failure, both for the criminal empire he helped destroy and for his own pathetic, self-destructive journey. His story, when viewed in its entirety, does not glamorize the gangster life. It eviscerates it, revealing the path for what it truly is: a desperate, hollow, and ultimately doomed scramble for a prize that, even if won, is always temporary and always paid for with the very soul of the winner. A lesson written in the blood of his victims and the endless, silent years of his own incarceration, a legacy that serves as a permanent, grim monument to the absolute emptiness of a life lived without a moral compass. The intricate web of personal relationships that Anthony Casso cultivated, exploited, and ultimately decimated throughout his life provides a devastatingly intimate lens through which to view the absolute vacuum of genuine human connection that defined his existence, revealing a man who viewed every individual, from his closest criminal partners to his own family, as instruments for his own advancement or obstacles to be removed, a solitary predator whose path was littered with the broken trust of those who mistakenly believed they held a place in his heart. His partnership with Vic Amuso began as a bond forged in the fires of their Brooklyn youth, a seemingly unbreakable alliance of two ambitious men who understood each other's drives and complemented each other's skills, with Amuso providing a more reserved, administrative counterpoint to Casso's explosive, operational brilliance. A partnership that should have been the foundation for a long and stable reign over the Lucchese family, but which instead devolved into a feedback loop of paranoia and murder, each man feeding the other's worst instincts until their united front crumbled into a joint fugitive nightmare that ended with both in cages, their friendship a casualty of their own shared psychosis. His alliance with Sammy the Bull Gravano was a meeting of two apex predators from different families, a relationship built on mutual respect for each other's lethal efficiency and a shared understanding that together they could undertake ventures and eliminate threats that were beyond the scope of their individual organizations. A coldly professional and highly effective partnership that ultimately could not survive Casso's escalating, erratic violence, particularly the sanctioned hit-on Gambino Capo Thomas Spio, which Gravano saw as a reckless provocation that threatened the delicate peace between the families and signaled that Casso was becoming an unpredictable and dangerous liability, leading to the inevitable dissolution of their powerful but purely utilitarian bond. Within his own Lucchese family, Casso's relationships were a toxic tapestry of fear and betrayal. He commanded a perverse form of loyalty from his direct underlings through a combination of shared criminal profits and the ever-present threat of horrifying death, creating a cadre of killers who carried out his orders with robotic efficiency but who undoubtedly lived in a state of constant, low-grade terror, knowing that a single misstep or a stray rumor could place them on their own boss's hit list, a dynamic that ensured short-term compliance but which sowed the seeds of the widespread resentment that would later blossom into the cooperation of witnesses like Pete Chiodo. The most tragic of his professional relationships were with the men he had murdered on mere suspicion, individuals like Lucchese capo John Santimoro, who had dedicated their lives to the family only to be eliminated on the flimsiest of whispers, their deaths ordered by a man who had once broken bread with them, a demonstration of Casso's belief that past loyalty was no guarantee of future safety and that human life was the cheapest currency in his economy of power. His relationship with his wife, Lillian, and their children presents the most complex and heartbreaking facet of his personal life. A relationship where he seemingly maintained a convincing facade of a devoted husband and father, providing for them, living with them in a comfortable home, and performing the rituals of family life, all while meticulously hiding the monstrous reality of his double life as a serial killer and crime lord, forcing them to become unwitting accomplices in his deception and then subjecting them to the unimaginable trauma of his very public downfall, his status as a cooperator, and the lifelong stigma of his crimes, a betrayal of their trust so profound it undoubtedly haunted their lives long after he was imprisoned. His network of corrupt law enforcement contacts, including the prized NYPD detective and the FBI agent he claimed to have compromised, represented relationships of pure, transactional utility, where loyalty was purchased with cash and maintained through mutual self-interest, a clear-eyed understanding that these men were not his friends but his employees, and that the moment the money or the protection stopped, the relationship would evaporate, a philosophy that made him an effective criminal, but which left him utterly alone when those same transactional relationships were inevitably discovered and severed by internal affairs investigations. The final, most damning relationship of all was the one he had with the Mafia itself, the institution to which he swore a blood oath of loyalty, an oath he invoked to justify countless murders, an oath he demanded others die for, but an oath he himself shattered without hesitation when it no longer served his personal interests. A betrayal that exposed the fundamental hypocrisy at the heart of the entire Cosa Nostra mythology and cemented his legacy as the ultimate hypocrite, a man who preached omertà while practicing perpetual treachery. In the end, every relationship Anthony Casso ever formed was ultimately conditional and transactional, a means to an end, and when those relationships ceased to serve his purpose, whether through perceived disloyalty, uselessness, or simply because he found a better deal with the federal government, he discarded them with the same cold efficiency with which he discarded a used weapon or a burned safe house. He died as he lived, profoundly alone, isolated not just by the concrete and steel of ADX Florence, but by the absolute emptiness of a soul that was incapable of forging a single, genuine, lasting bond with another human being, a walking testament to the fact that a life built on the foundation of using people is a life that inevitably concludes in the most desolate and absolute solitude imaginable, a fate that was far more terrifying and fitting for the man known as Gaspipe than any mere execution could ever have been. The stark and unbridgeable chasm between the public facade of Anthony Casso and the terrifying reality of his private life stands as a masterclass in psychological compartmentalization, a deliberate and sustained fracturing of the self that allowed him to present a carefully curated image of a successful businessman and devoted family man to the outside world while simultaneously orchestrating a sprawling empire of murder and corruption from the shadows, a double life maintained with such discipline and chilling effectiveness that it forces us to question the very nature of identity and the terrifying human capacity for duplicity when driven by insatiable ambition and a complete lack of moral grounding. To his neighbors in the quiet, respectable communities where he chose to live, Anthony Casso was the epitome of the American dream made flesh. A well-dressed, polite, and prosperous man who doted on his children, attended family functions, and managed what appeared to be a legitimate plumbing supply business, a facade so convincing and so normal that it rendered him virtually invisible to the conventional world, allowing him to blend into the suburban landscape like a predator perfectly camouflaged within its environment, his violent true nature hidden behind a mask of disarming normalcy. This public persona was not a casual disguise but a meticulously constructed and actively maintained weapon, a strategic tool that provided him with the ultimate cover, allowing him to operate with impunity under the very noses of law enforcement who were hunting for a monstrous gangster, not the affable father next door. A deception that granted him a freedom of movement and a layer of insulation that his more flamboyant and recognizable contemporaries, like John Gotti, foolishly sacrificed for public notoriety. Behind this carefully constructed veneer of normality, however, existed a man who lived by an entirely different and horrifying set of rules. A man who conducted meetings in social clubs and parked cars to plan murders, who coolly discussed the logistics of body disposal, and who authorized hits on police officers and former friends with the detached calm of a corporate executive reviewing a quarterly report. A man for whom human life held no more intrinsic value than a piece on a chessboard to be sacrificed for strategic advantage. The psychological mechanism that allowed this duality to exist was not merely lying to others. It was a profound and willful fragmentation of his own consciousness, ability to wall off the monstrous aspects of his life from the domestic ones, to shift gears from ordering an execution to helping his child with homework without any apparent emotional carryover. A skill that speaks to a mind so thoroughly divorced from empathy that it could toggle between identities as easily as changing clothes. This compartmentalization extended to his financial life, where the massive, blood-soaked profits from hijacking and narcotics were laundered through his legitimate-looking business fronts and invested in property and a comfortable lifestyle, seamlessly blending the fruits of his violence with the trappings of respectable middle-class achievement, further cementing his cover and allowing him to present a coherent, if entirely fictional, narrative of success through hard work and business acumen. The maintenance of this double life required constant vigilance and an enormous expenditure of mental energy. He had to remember his lies, manage his schedules to avoid catastrophic overlaps, and control his notoriously volatile temper in public settings, a performance so demanding that it likely contributed to the intense paranoia that defined his later years, as the fear of his two worlds colliding became a persistent, gnawing anxiety at the core of his existence. The eventual collapse of this elaborate facade was as total as it was inevitable, beginning with his induction into the ranks of the top administration, which pulled him deeper into the spotlight of law enforcement scrutiny, and accelerating with the internal purges that created legions of enemies willing to talk, until finally the carefully constructed wall between his two lives was obliterated by his arrest and the subsequent media frenzy that exposed the loving family man from New Jersey as The psychopathic underboss Anthony Gaspipe Casso, a revelation that shattered the lives of his innocent family and laid bare the terrifying truth he had worked so hard to conceal. The aftermath of this exposure was the ultimate punishment for a man who valued control above all else. He lost command over his own narrative. His story was taken from him and rewritten by prosecutors, journalists, and the countless witnesses who poured out the sordid details of his real life, until the respectable facade was completely erased, replaced in the public consciousness forever by the monstrous image of the killer, the rat, the man who betrayed everyone who ever trusted him. The story of Anthony Casso's double life is therefore a cautionary tale about the seductive and ultimately destructive power of the mask, a demonstration that a life built on such a fundamental and pervasive lie, no matter how skillfully maintained, is inherently unstable and destined for a catastrophic collapse. A collapse that does not just bring down the criminal, but devastates the innocent lives entangled in his web of deception, leaving behind a legacy of ruin that serves as the final, ugly truth behind the charming smile and the respectable facade of the man who thought he could live two separate lives forever. The immense and sobering financial footprint of Anthony Casso's criminal empire, a sprawling network of illicit enterprises that generated tens of millions of dollars over his decades-long career, reveals a great deal not only about the vast economic power wielded by the Mafia at its peak, but also about Casso's own sophisticated understanding of capital as a tool for securing power, insulating himself from justice, and funding his insatiable appetite for both luxury and violence, painting a picture of a man who was as much a coldly calculating CEO as he was a ruthless street killer. His primary and most reliable revenue stream was his iron-fisted control over the hijacking rackets at John F. Kennedy International Airport, a complex and highly organized operation that functioned with the brutal efficiency of a predatory corporation, employing inside informants to identify high-value cargo, teams of skilled thieves to intercept trucks, and a distribution network to funnel stolen goods, from electronics and clothing to pharmaceuticals and perishable food, into a shadow economy that stretched across the tri-state area, generating a steady, massive flow of untaxed cash that formed the financial bedrock of his power and demonstrated his ability to identify and exploit a critical vulnerability in the nation's commercial infrastructure. Alongside this, his deep involvement in the narcotics trade, specifically heroin, despite the Mafia's official ban, showcased his pragmatic and profit-driven mindset. He recognized the astronomical returns offered by drugs and plunged into the market with characteristic audacity, establishing importation channels and distribution networks that flooded New York City streets with poison, a decision that was wildly profitable but which also placed a target on his back from both traditionalist, mafiosi and federal agents who prioritized drug kingpins, illustrating his willingness to break any rule, written or unwritten, for the sake of financial gain. These major ventures were supplemented by a portfolio of more traditional mafia rackets, including loan sharking at exorbitant interest rates that trapped small business owners and gamblers in cycles of perpetual debt, illegal gambling operations that siphoned money from communities, and labor racketeering that allowed him to extort money from construction companies and unions by threatening strikes and work stoppages, creating a diversified criminal income stream that ensured money would continue to flow even if one of his operations was temporarily disrupted by law enforcement. The management and laundering of this enormous river of dirty money was a critical component of his operation. He funneled cash through seemingly legitimate fronts, like his plumbing supply company, and invested in real estate and other assets, a process that not only disguised the illegal origins of his wealth but also allowed him to project an image of legitimate success, further cementing his cover and providing him with the resources to live a life of considerable luxury, with expensive homes, cars, and designer clothes that were a world away from his humble Bensonhurst beginnings. However, the single most significant expense in his criminal budget, and perhaps his most strategic investment, was the vast sums of money he allocated to corruption, paying huge and regular bribes to a network of compromised law enforcement officers, including NYPD detectives and his alleged FBI contact, R. Lindley DeVecchio. These payments were not incidental but were considered essential operating costs, the price of doing business at the highest level of organized crime, and they bought him something far more valuable than material goods. They purchased information, impunity, and time, allowing him to evade arrests, anticipate raids, and eliminate rivals with a precision that made him seem untouchable for years. This strategic use of capital to corrupt the very system designed to stop him highlights a chilling understanding of human nature and institutional vulnerability, showing that Casso viewed the law not as an immutable force but as another system to be manipulated and purchased, a commodity available to the highest bidder. The sheer scale of his financial operations also dictated his value within the Lucchese family. As a top earner, he was not just a killer but a vital financial pillar, and the millions he kicked up to the administration guaranteed him influence, protection, and a rapid ascent through the ranks, proving that in the Mafia, while violence was the language of power, money was the grammar that structured it. When his empire finally collapsed, the financial aftermath was as chaotic as the violent one. Assets were seized by the government, his revenue streams were dismantled, and the intricate web of corruption was exposed and slowly untangled, leaving behind a trail of financial ruin for his business partners and a legacy of economic damage to the legitimate industries he had parasitized for so long. The story of Anthony Casso's wealth is therefore a crucial, often understated chapter in his biography, demonstrating that his power was not merely physical but profoundly economic, and that his ability to generate and strategically deploy massive sums of money was just as important to his reign of terror as his willingness to pull the trigger. A reminder that the most dangerous criminals are often those who understand that in the modern world, financial capital can be weaponized just as effectively as a lead pipe or a .38 caliber pistol, and that corruption is often the most potent and insidious weapon in a sophisticated predator's arsenal. The profound and irreversible transformation of the New York underworld in the bloody wake of Anthony Casso's treachery cannot be overstated, for his decision to break his sacred oath and cooperate with the government did not merely result in a handful of new indictments. It fundamentally altered the psychological and operational landscape of La Cosa Nostra, delivering a moral and strategic blow from which the traditional five families would never truly recover, shattering the already fragile myth of omertà into a million irreparable pieces and ushering in an era where turning informant shifted from being an unthinkable act of shame to a perceived, if perilous, strategic option for cornered mafiosi. Before Casso's defection, the Code of Silence, while often honored in the breach, still held a powerful symbolic and practical weight. High-profile cooperators like Henry Hill and Joe Valachi were seen as lower-level players or outliers, their betrayals damaging but not existential to the institution itself. But when Anthony Gaspipe Casso, a made man, a feared underboss, a prolific earner, and a stone-cold killer, chose to sit down with the FBI, it sent a seismic shock through the entire underworld, proving that even the most hardened, high-ranking, and seemingly committed individuals were vulnerable to the temptations of self-preservation when faced with the certainty of dying in a cage. His cooperation, coming on the heels of Sammy the Bull Gravano's earth-shattering testimony against John Gotti, created a devastating 1-2 punch that normalized what was once considered the ultimate sin, creating a dangerous precedent that every subsequent prosecutor could dangle in front of a reluctant made man, asking the simple, damning question, if Gaspipe and the Bull could talk, why can't you? This new reality irrevocably poisoned the well of trust within the families. Where once a boss could command loyalty through a combination of respect and fear, he now had to look at his closest confidants and wonder if they were secretly weighing their options, if they were wearing a wire, or if a moment of perceived weakness would land them on a government witness list instead of just a hit list, creating an atmosphere of paralyzing paranoia that stifled initiative, discouraged long-term planning, and made the Mafia a far less efficient and resilient criminal enterprise. Operationally, the sheer volume and detail of the intelligence Casso provided, even the parts later deemed unreliable, gave federal investigators an unprecedented and granular roadmap of the Lucchese family's inner workings, from its financial structures and corrupt alliances to its murder protocols and secret meeting places, enabling a wave of prosecutions that not only removed key players but also dismantled the very infrastructure that had allowed the family to function for decades, forcing a chaotic and debilitating reorganization that left it weakened and vulnerable to infiltration by new, more agile criminal organizations. The specific nature of his testimony, which detailed the inner workings of the commission and the cross-family collaborations, also damaged the fragile alliances between the five families, as his revelations about plots against Gotti and other inter-family dealings bred a new level of suspicion and discord, making the coordinated action that had once been the Mafia's great strength increasingly difficult and rare. Furthermore, his allegations of deep-seated corruption within the FBI, while never fully proven in a way that satisfied a court of law, cast a long and dark shadow over the Bureau's organized crime division, leading to internal purges, heightened scrutiny, and a more cautious, protocol-driven approach that, while more ethical, also made it slightly more difficult to cultivate the kind of deep cover sources that had been so effective in the past. In the years that followed, the New York Mafia, as it existed in the era of Casso's rise, entered a period of irreversible decline. It did not vanish, but it was forced to contract, to operate with less violence and far lower profiles, to abandon its aspirations of controlling entire sectors of the economy, and to cede ground to more decentralized and ethnically diverse crime syndicates that were less bound by tradition and therefore less vulnerable to the kind of systemic collapse triggered by a high-level betrayal. The legend of Anthony Casso therefore became a ghost that haunted the underworld, a cautionary tale told not of his power, but of his weakness, a story used to remind new recruits of the ultimate price of treachery while simultaneously reminding the old guard of their own terrifying vulnerability. His legacy is thus one of paradoxical destruction. He was a man who loved the Mafia and its culture of power, yet his actions did more to dismantle that culture than almost any single law enforcement operation ever could, because he attacked it from within, destroying its foundational myths and proving that its core principle was a lie, leaving behind a quieter, smaller, and infinitely more cynical criminal landscape, a world he would no longer recognize and which would never again produce a figure quite like Anthony Gaspipe Casso, the demon who, in trying to save himself, ended up burning down the very temple in which he had once prayed. The stark and haunting geography of Anthony Casso's life, the physical locations that served as the backdrop for his ascent, his reign, and his ultimate damnation, forms a poignant and symbolic map of a journey from the vibrant, crowded streets of his youth to the ultimate, soul-crushing isolation of a supermax cell, each address and coordinates telling a silent story about the man he was and the empty shell he became, a pilgrimage through landscapes of power, violence, and final, absolute desolation. It all began in the tight-knit, working-class neighborhood of Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, a world defined by its stoops and social clubs, where the air was thick with the sounds of Italian and the unspoken rules of the street, a place where a young boy could watch and learn how respect was earned through fear and how power was the only true currency, a formative environment that shaped his entire worldview and provided him with his first lessons in the brutal arithmetic of human relationships. Lessons he would carry with him like a loaded weapon for the rest of his days. From these crowded streets, his orbit expanded to the sprawling, chaotic tarmac of John F. Kennedy International Airport, a place that became his personal fortress and his private treasury, a landscape of roaring jets and anonymous cargo bays where he built his financial empire through hijacking, a location he understood not as a hub of travel but as a vulnerable artery in the body of commerce, a place to be exploited with surgical precision, and his control over this domain was a testament to his ability to see opportunity where others saw only chaos, turning a symbol of American progress into an engine of his own criminal ambition. The social clubs of Brooklyn, particularly the storefronts and backrooms that served as the unofficial offices of the Lucchese family, were the boardrooms where his power was solidified, dark, smoke-filled spaces where murders were ordered over espresso and cannoli, where alliances were forged with a handshake that could just as easily be a death sentence, these clubs representing the dark, beating heart of the Mafia's social structure, a world hidden in plain sight where Anthony Casso was not a monster but a king, respected, feared, and obeyed by the men who shared this secret geography with him. As his power grew, so did the geography of his domestic facade, moving to comfortable, unassuming homes in New Jersey, houses in quiet suburbs with manicured lawns and two-car garages, places chosen specifically for their anonymity and their stark contrast to the violence of his professional life, addresses that were meant to scream normalcy and legitimacy to anyone who looked, a deliberate and calculated camouflage that allowed the predator to live undetected among his prey, a physical manifestation of the profound duality that defined his existence. The final, desperate chapter of his life on the outside was mapped not by stable addresses but by a frantic, rootless trail of cheap motels and anonymous safe houses from Pennsylvania to New Jersey, a fugitive's geography defined by paranoia and transience, where power was reduced to the ability to stay one step ahead, to find a new payphone, to spot a surveillance team before they spotted him, a bleak and exhausting existence that was the polar opposite of the stable, rooted power he had once commanded from his social clubs and suburban homes. The end of that road was a specific, unremarkable house in Mount Olive, New Jersey, the coordinates where his run from the law conclusively ended, where the phantom was finally made flesh and handcuffed, the place where the legend of Gaspipe the ghost was terminated and the reality of Anthony Casso, federal prisoner, began. The next phase of his geographical existence was the cold, impersonal architecture of the American prison system, first in holding facilities and then, definitively, in the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado, a place less a prison and more a monument to human nullification, a collection of concrete and steel pods buried in the high desert, a landscape chosen for its own inherent desolation, where the stark, unforgiving mountains stood as a permanent reminder of the impassable barriers that now surrounded him. His world, which had once encompassed the entire 5 boroughs and beyond, was now reduced to a single, concrete cell measuring 7 by 12 feet. A space where the only view was of a sliver of sky through a window designed to prevent him from seeing anything of substance. A space where the only geography was the cracked paint on the wall and the only journey was the slow march of time itself. This was the final and most fitting location on the map of his life, a place of absolute sensory deprivation, a void where man defined by his actions, his sounds, his violence, and his power was systematically stripped of all stimulus, all influence, all identity, until nothing was left but the silent, screaming awareness of his own utter and complete defeat. The geographical arc of his life, from the teeming, life-filled streets of Brooklyn to the sterile, silent cell in Colorado, is a narrative in itself, a story of a world that steadily shrank from an empire to a kingdom to a hideout to a cage, a physical manifestation of a soul that was itself collapsing inwards, consumed by its own darkness, until the only territory left to rule was the 6 feet of space between his bed and his toilet, a kingdom of nothing for the man who had once wanted everything. He died not in the city that made him, but in the prison that unmade him, his body likely processed by the state with the same impersonal efficiency with which he had once disposed of his victims, his final resting place a secret, an unmarked plot or an anonymous ashes, the last geographical detail of a life that had become so toxic that even in death, it had to be contained, hidden, and erased from the map for good. The weaponization of information was the central, defining strategy of Anthony Casso's entire criminal career, a philosophy he applied with relentless consistency, first by aggressively seeking it through his network of corrupt insiders to protect his empire and eliminate his enemies, and then, in a stunning reversal, by becoming a fountain of it for the federal government in a desperate attempt to save himself, a trajectory that demonstrates how the same tool can be used both to build a fortress and to demolish it, depending on the desperation of the hand that wields it. During his ascent and reign, information was his most prized commodity, more valuable than any shipment of stolen goods or any bag of cash, because it represented the power of foresight, the ability to see the future moves of his rivals and the police, granting him an almost mythical aura of invincibility that was as potent a weapon as any gun or knife he ever wielded. His network of corrupt law enforcement contacts, most notably his alleged source within the FBI, was not a passive asset but an active intelligence agency that he ran with meticulous care, paying huge bribes for specific, actionable intelligence that allowed him to conduct his business with impunity, warning him of wiretaps, impending indictments, and the identities of potential informants within his own organization, making him not just a gangster but a spy master in the shadow war between the Mafia and the state. This inside information allowed him to practice a form of preemptive warfare that was both brutally effective and deeply destabilizing. He didn't just react to threats, he annihilated them in their infancy, ordering hits on individuals like Lucchese capo John Santimoro based on the mere suspicion of cooperation, a tactic that kept his organization secure in the short term but which also created a culture of such intense paranoia that it ultimately strangled the trust and loyalty necessary for the family's long-term survival. The intelligence he gathered also extended to his criminal rivals, allowing him to understand their weaknesses, their alliances, and their own secret plots. Intelligence he used to outmaneuver them in the endless struggle for territory and profit, making him a masterful strategic player on the complex chessboard of the New York underworld. The turning point, the moment information began to flow in the opposite direction, was his arrest and the crushing realization that the government's case against him was insurmountable, that he was facing a certainty of dying in prison, a fate his psychopathic mind could not accept, leading him to make the calculated decision to transform the vast repository of secrets in his head from a shield into a sword, to be used against the very world he had sworn to protect. His cooperation was, in its initial phase, an intelligence dump of unprecedented scale and detail. He provided names, dates, locations, and motives for over a dozen murders. He laid bare the financial structures of his hijacking and narcotics operations, and he detailed the inner workings of the Mafia's commission, providing a comprehensive organizational chart of the entire Lucchese family that enabled prosecutors to target its remaining leadership with surgical precision. Most explosively, he provided detailed accounts of his corrupt relationships with law enforcement, pointing a finger directly at FBI agent Lindley DeVecchio and alleging a years-long conspiracy of leaked information that had enabled multiple murders, an accusation that, even if never fully proven in a criminal court, triggered a seismic crisis within the FBI's organized crime division and led to years of internal investigations and a permanent stain on the Bureau's reputation. However, his lifelong habit of manipulating and controlling information ultimately proved to be his undoing even in this new role. He could not resist the impulse to lie, to embellish, to withhold certain facts and exaggerate others, attempting to use his testimony to settle old scores and shape the narrative to his own advantage. A fatal miscalculation that demonstrated he did not understand the fundamental rules of the new game he was playing. The government's ultimate conclusion that he was an unreliable witness and their subsequent voiding of his cooperation agreement was the final, ironic twist in his relationship with information. The man who had lived by the secret was now destroyed by his own inability to tell the whole truth, his most powerful weapon rendered useless because the hand that held it was too deceitful to be trusted. In the end, the story of Anthony Casso and information is a tragicomedy of errors, a tale of a man who mastered the art of gathering and using secrets for power but who failed to understand that in the world of law and order, the ultimate value of information is tied inextricably to its veracity, a concept his corrupted psyche could never truly grasp, leading him to sabotage his last, best chance for salvation and ensuring that the vast treasure trove of knowledge in his head would ultimately be worth less than nothing, becoming instead the final, definitive proof of his own incorrigible nature and the key that locked his own prison door from the inside for all eternity. The concept of loyalty, that sacred and endlessly invoked pillar of the Mafia's self-mythology, was in the hands of Anthony Casso not a principle to be upheld but a weapon to be wielded, a one-way street where he demanded absolute, unquestioning fealty from every individual around him while reserving for himself the right to betray anyone at any moment if he deemed it necessary for his survival or advancement. A hypocritical and self-serving interpretation that exposed the fundamental rot at the core of the Cosa Nostra code and ultimately turned the family he led into a cannibalistic organism that consumed its own. From his earliest days as a young associate, he understood that the performance of loyalty was a currency that could purchase trust and opportunity, and he played the part of the devoted soldier with such conviction that he quickly earned the confidence of his superiors, who saw in him a rare combination of blind obedience and ruthless initiative, a young man who would follow orders without question and who understood that the family's interests, as defined by those in power, were the only interests that mattered. This performance, however, was always a calculated act, a means to an end, for Casso's only true and unwavering loyalty was to the entity of Anthony Casso, a fact that became terrifyingly clear as he ascended to power and began to demand levels of devotion from his subordinates that he himself was psychologically incapable of giving, creating a dangerous imbalance where he held everyone to a standard that he was free to violate at will. His reign as underboss was therefore a dictatorship of conditional loyalty, where any perceived slight, any hint of independent thought, any rumor of dissatisfaction was treated not as a minor infraction but as a capital crime, an act of treason punishable by death, a policy that transformed the Lucchese family from a criminal corporation into a paranoid court where fawning sycophancy became the only safe posture and honest counsel became a death sentence. The bloody purge of the late 1980s and early 1990s, which he orchestrated with Vic Amuso, was the logical endpoint of this warped philosophy, a grotesque spectacle where men who had dedicated decades of their lives to the family were murdered on the flimsiest of suspicions, their past loyalty counting for nothing against the present paranoia of their leaders, their deaths serving as a grim warning to others about the absolute and unforgiving nature of the loyalty Casso demanded. The most profound perversion of this concept was his treatment of those who were, by the Mafia's own twisted rules, technically loyal. When Capo Pete Chiodo was indicted, his loyalty was immediately and violently questioned, and a hit was ordered not because he had betrayed the family, but because Casso and Amuso feared he might betray them in the future. A preemptive execution that demonstrated loyalty was not a state of being but a fleeting condition that could be revoked by the whims of a paranoid leader. This environment of absolute fear did not, as Casso believed, strengthen the family's bonds. It corroded them completely, creating a silent, seething undercurrent of resentment and terror that made the organization brittle and vulnerable, ensuring that when the external pressure from law enforcement finally became unbearable, the internal structure, built on a foundation of fear rather than genuine allegiance, would shatter rather than bend. The ultimate and most damning betrayal, of course, was his own decision to become a government informant, an act that violated every tenet of the oath he had sworn and the code he had so violently enforced, revealing his lifelong demand for loyalty to be the hollowest of shams, a convenient tool he used to control others but which he never for a moment intended to apply to himself. In doing so, he did not just break a rule, he desecrated the very idea that had held the Mafia together for generations, sending a message to every made man in America that the code of omertà was dead, that the bosses who demanded your life would sell yours out to save a single day of their own, and that the entire edifice of honor among thieves was a cruel joke perpetuated by the most treacherous among them. His subsequent behavior as a cooperator, where he lied and manipulated the very prosecutors he was supposed to be helping, was a final, fitting coda to his relationship with loyalty. He was even disloyal to his new masters, proving that his pathological self-interest was so absolute that he could not faithfully serve any cause, any organization, or any individual other than the reflection he saw in the mirror. The story of Anthony Casso and loyalty is therefore the story of a black hole, a destructive force that sucked in all light and commitment from those around him, giving nothing back but emptiness and betrayal, a force that ultimately collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, leaving behind a legacy that proves one simple, terrible truth. A man who demands loyalty from everyone but gives it to no one is a man who is destined to die utterly and completely alone, surrounded not by comrades, but by the cold, hard walls of his own making, a king of nothing, betrayed by the only person he ever truly served. The inevitable and total collapse of Anthony Casso's meticulously constructed world, a downfall that was not a single event but a slow-motion avalanche of his own making, triggered by the compounding weight of his paranoia, his unchecked violence, and his fundamental inability to understand that true power requires a foundation of stability and trust, stands as a classic study in the self-destructive nature of pure, predatory ambition when it is completely divorced from any semblance of long-term strategy or human connection. The first fissures in his empire appeared not from external pressure but from internal decay, specifically the reign of terror he initiated alongside Vic Amuso, a series of internal murders that were intended to solidify their control but which instead functioned like a cancer, metastasizing throughout the Lucchese family and creating a critical weakness where once there had been strength, as experienced capos and skilled earners were replaced by fear and silence, leaving the organization financially and operationally crippled just as the federal government was beginning its most aggressive assault in history. This self-inflicted wound was compounded by his own escalating recklessness, a hubris born from years of believing his intelligence network made him untouchable, leading to audacious and high-risk acts like the murder of NYPD officer Peter Calabro and the sanctioned hit on a Gambino capo, actions that drew the focused, white-hot attention of every law enforcement agency in New York and transformed him from a priority into an obsession, a symbol of the Mafia's brazen defiance that had to be taken down at any cost. The flight into fugitive status was the point of no return, the moment the architect became a ghost in his own crumbling kingdom, as attempting to manage a complex criminal enterprise from a series of anonymous motel rooms through payphones and intermediaries was an impossible task that only accelerated the chaos, creating a power vacuum that was filled by confusion, resentment, and the growing realization among the rank and file that their leaders were not strategic geniuses but frightened men, whose primary concern was their own survival. The arrest of Vic Amuso was a catastrophic blow, leaving Casso alone and isolated, the last king of a lost realm, now bearing the full, undivided weight of the government's wrath, a pressure that finally forced him to confront the one enemy he could not outsmart, outshoot, or corrupt: the certainty of a life spent in a prison cell until the moment he died. His decision to cooperate was the final, desperate act of a cornered animal, the ultimate betrayal that shattered the last remaining pillar of his identity. But even in this, he failed to succeed, because his lifelong habits of manipulation and deceit rendered him incapable of the straightforward truth-telling the government demanded, leading to the voiding of his agreement and his final, definitive condemnation. The 13 life sentences he received were not just a judicial punishment, they were a formal, legal pronouncement of his total and absolute defeat, a repudiation of every choice he had ever made, every life he had ever taken, and every dollar he had ever stolen, reducing his entire existence to a single, inescapable conclusion: failure. His consignment to the ADX Florence supermax prison was the physical manifestation of this failure, a concrete and steel coffin where every aspect of the environment was scientifically designed to extinguish the very qualities that had defined him: his autonomy, his influence, his capacity for action, leaving him with nothing but the silent, screaming awareness of his own impotence. The long, slow years of his incarceration were a form of psychological execution, a gradual draining away of not just his life, but his very essence, as the man who had once commanded the attention of the entire underworld was forgotten, his name fading from the headlines, his power evaporating into the sterile, recycled air of his cell, his legacy becoming a cautionary tale of waste and ruin. His death from cancer in 2020 was the final, quiet period at the end of a sentence written in violence and betrayal, an anonymous end for a man who had craved notoriety, a solitary death for a man who had demanded absolute loyalty, a painful death for a man who had inflicted so much pain on others, a symmetry that felt less like coincidence and more like a final, karmic judgment. The collapse of Anthony Casso is therefore a story with a moral clarity that his life so profoundly lacked, a demonstration that a path built on betrayal, paranoia, and violence cannot lead to any destination other than isolation and ruin, that the pursuit of power for its own sake, without a higher purpose or a capacity for genuine alliance, is a fruitless endeavor that consumes the pursuer long before the prize is ever truly won. His life stands as a monumental warning, a stark reminder that the true cost of such existence is not measured in years in prison, but in the utter and complete annihilation of the soul, a price that Anthony Casso, in all his cunning and brutality, proved ultimately willing to pay, leaving behind nothing but the echo of a name that once inspired fear, and the profound silence that followed. The enduring mystery and unresolved questions that swirl like ghosts around the legacy of Anthony Casso serve as a haunting coda to his life, creating a narrative that is frustratingly incomplete and ensuring that his story continues to provoke debate and speculation among historians, journalists, and true crime aficionados long after his death. A fittingly ambiguous end for a man who was a master of shadows and deception until his very last breath. The most persistent and damaging of these mysteries revolves around the full extent and validity of his allegations of corruption within the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Specifically his detailed claims that FBI agent Lindley DeVecchio was a paid informant for the Lucchese family who provided intelligence that led directly to multiple murders. Accusations that were never definitively proven in a criminal court and which DeVecchio consistently and vehemently denied, leaving a permanent stain on the Bureau's reputation and a lingering question of whether Casso, for all his lies, was telling a terrible truth about one of the most damaging breaches of trust in the history of American law enforcement, or whether this was simply the master manipulator's final, most brilliant act of revenge, skillfully planting a seed of doubt that would forever taint the very institution that had captured him. The true number of his victims remains another dark and uncertain territory, as Casso himself, in his cooperation, provided details on murders both known and unknown, but his later proven deceptions cast a shadow over every confession, leaving open the possibility that he took credit for kills that were not his own or, more disturbingly, that he withheld information on other, still unsolved homicides, their secrets dying with him in his supermax cell, a final act of control over the narrative of his own violence. The ultimate fate of the vast sums of money he accumulated throughout his criminal career is another unresolved thread, with millions of dollars generated from hijacking, narcotics, and racketeering never fully accounted for, leading to speculation about hidden caches of cash, investments in legitimate businesses under other names, or assets quietly secured for his family. A financial ghost that continues to hint at a shadow empire that outlived its creator, though it is just as likely that the chaotic purges and the relentless legal pressure simply caused the fortune to dissipate into the underworld's ether, seized by rivals or spent on his defense and his fugitive years. The psychological question of what, if anything, he truly felt in his final years of isolation is perhaps the most profound and unanswerable mystery of all. Did a man so devoid of empathy ever experience a moment of genuine remorse for the lives he had destroyed, for the families he had shattered, for the institution he had betrayed, or was his only regret the fact that he had been caught? His solitary confinement merely a boring and frustrating inconvenience for a psyche that was incapable of the profound self-reflection that such a punishment is designed to induce? We will never know if the silence of ADX Florence ever spoke to him in a way that the screams of his victims never could, or if he simply passed the time replaying his violent glories and scheming about impossible escapes, his internal landscape as barren and lifeless as the concrete walls that surrounded him. The full scope of his corrupt network within the NYPD and other agencies also remains partially obscured, as Casso's testimony on this front was often vague and self-serving, leaving investigators to wonder if he had protected the identities of his most valuable contacts even as he was supposedly cooperating, taking those names with him to the grave as a final, twisted act of loyalty to the very corruption that had sustained him for so long. The impact of his betrayal on the specific, day-to-day operations of the Lucchese crime family is another area of historical speculation, as it is impossible to fully quantify how many ongoing rackets were dismantled, how many alliances were broken, and how many potential future leaders were lost because of the intelligence he provided. A cascade of damage that likely extended far beyond the indictments that were publicly filed. The question of whether any aspect of his cooperation was driven by a genuine, if twisted, desire for atonement, or whether it was purely a transaction from start to finish, is another enigma locked within the black box of his consciousness, a mystery that his own actions deliberately clouded with lies and manipulations until the very end. Even the circumstances of his death are shrouded in a certain bureaucratic silence, a quiet, institutional processing of a human being who had become a problem to be managed, his final moments as hidden from view as the many murders he had committed in shadowy corners of the city he once ruled. These lingering uncertainties ensure that the story of Anthony Casso can never be neatly filed away and forgotten. The gaps in the record, the contradictions in the testimony, and the sheer scale of his unverifiable claims act as a kind of negative space that gives his legend a strange, unsettling longevity. A ghost story for the modern age that continues to whisper of corrupt agents, hidden money, and unanswered questions. A final, masterful deception from a man who understood that the most powerful secrets are the ones you never fully reveal, leaving the world to forever wonder about the true depths of the darkness that was Anthony Gaspipe Casso. The profound and often overlooked impact of Anthony Casso's reign of terror on the innocent bystanders. The collateral damage whose lives were irrevocably scarred not by a bullet but by the pervasive atmosphere of fear and corruption he helped to cultivate, forms a silent and heartbreaking chapter of his story. A testament to the way a single criminal's ambition can send out ripples of suffering that touch individuals and communities far removed from the inner sanctum of the Mafia's secret. Society. Consider the small business owners in the garment district or at the airports. The hard-working men and women whose livelihoods were subtly or overtly controlled by Casso's rackets, who were forced to pay a hidden tax in the form of kickbacks for protection they did not want or need, their entrepreneurial dreams stifled under the weight of a parasitic organization that viewed their success not as something to celebrate but as something to exploit. Their sense of security and independence slowly eroded by the silent, omnipresent threat of violence that Casso represented. Think of the countless addicts on the streets of New York, their lives and health destroyed by the heroin that Casso so profitably pumped into their neighborhoods. A human toll that can never be calculated. Each life a story of potential and hope cut short by the poison he distributed with cold, calculated greed. His legacy written in the broken families and personal tragedies that spread like a virus from his narcotics operations. A form of violence that was slower and less dramatic than a shooting but ultimately far more widespread and devastating in its human cost. The families of the men he murdered, the wives who became widows, the children who grew up without fathers, were condemned to a lifetime of grief and unanswered questions. Their loss compounded by the grotesque spectacle of their loved one's killer attempting to barter his knowledge of the murder for a reduced sentence, reducing their profound personal tragedy to a mere bargaining chip in a legal negotiation, a final, insulting violation that denied them the closure and justice they so deeply deserved. The residents of the communities where he operated, from Bensonhurst to the suburbs of New Jersey, lived under a silent, unspoken understanding that certain places were controlled by dangerous men, that certain topics were not to be discussed, and that the institutions meant to protect them could potentially be compromised, creating a low-grade, persistent anxiety that became the background noise of their daily lives, a subtle corrosion of their trust in the very fabric of their society. The honest union members whose pension funds were looted and whose contracts were manipulated by Casso's labor racketeering saw their hard-earned benefits and their rights at the bargaining table diminished by a shadowy force they could neither see nor fight. Their financial security undermined for the profit of a man who never did an honest day's work in his life. The very concept of justice itself was a victim of Anthony Casso, as his allegations of widespread corruption, whether entirely true or a masterful blend of fact and fiction, created a lasting crisis of confidence in the system, forcing the public to wonder if the authorities who were supposed to protect them were, in fact, in league with the very predators they were hunting. A suspicion that damages the social contract in a way that is difficult to ever fully repair. His own family, his wife and children, are perhaps the ultimate example of this collateral damage, sentenced to a lifetime of shame, fear, and notoriety simply by sharing his name, forced to bear the burden of his monstrous actions and live with the knowledge that the husband and father they loved was a prolific serial killer. A psychological trauma so profound that its full impact is impossible for any outsider to truly comprehend. These are the stories that are often lost in the dramatic tales of mob hits and FBI stings, the quiet, unrecorded histories of people who were never made men, who never swore a blood oath, but whose lives were fundamentally altered by the gravitational pull of Anthony Casso's darkness. His story, therefore, is not just the story of one man's rise and fall. It is the story of 1,000 smaller, quieter falls that happened in his wake, the shattered lives and broken dreams that were merely stepping stones on his path to power. To focus only on Casso and his immediate rivals is to miss the larger, more damning picture of the human cost of organized crime, a cost that is paid not in the underworld but in the everyday world by people who ask for nothing more than to live their lives in peace and safety, a peace that men like Anthony Casso systematically and deliberately stole from them for their own profit and aggrandizement. This is the true legacy of his violence, a legacy not of power, but of power's absence, a void of security and trust that he helped to create and which lingered long after he was locked away, a silent, spreading stain that serves as the most powerful and enduring indictment of the life he chose to live and the path of destruction he left behind for others to navigate long after he was gone. The chilling and instructive parallels between the rise and fall of Anthony Casso and the trajectories of other infamous American mobsters create a recurring and darkly familiar narrative pattern in the history of organized crime. A pattern that suggests the very qualities that enable a man to seize power within this secretive and violent world are the same qualities that guarantee his eventual and often spectacular downfall. A self-correcting mechanism of destruction built into the foundation of the Mafia itself. Like Al Capone before him, Casso understood that immense financial power and a reputation for ruthless violence were the twin engines of criminal dominance. But also like Capone, he discovered that the very notoriety he cultivated would eventually draw the focused, unrelenting attention of the federal government, transforming him from a local problem into a national priority whose capture became a matter of institutional pride for the Justice Department. Similar to the flamboyant John Gotti, Casso possessed a deep-seated and ultimately fatal arrogance, a belief in his own intellectual superiority over the system that sought to contain him, a trait that led Gotti to mock the law from the steps of a courthouse and that led Casso to believe he could outsmart and manipulate the federal cooperation agreement, a miscalculation that for Gotti meant life in prison and for Casso meant the voiding of his deal and a one-way ticket to a supermax cell. The path of Sammy the Bull Gravano serves as a dark mirror to Casso's own. Both were feared and highly effective underbosses who made the calculated decision to break their blood oath and cooperate. Yet where Gravano understood the transaction required and provided the testimony needed to secure his freedom, however temporary, Casso's inherent duplicity and inability to adhere to any rules, even those of his own salvation, led him to sabotage his own deal, demonstrating that his psychopathy made him unfit for even the pragmatic betrayal that saved other, more disciplined turncoats. The story of Vincent the Chin Gigante, the boss of the Genovese family who feigned mental illness for decades to avoid prosecution, presents another fascinating contrast. Where Gigante used a performance of weakness and instability as a shield, Casso relied on a performance of invincibility and hypercompetence as a sword, two opposing strategies that both ultimately failed, proving that no mask, whether of a madman or a mastermind, can protect a man forever from the consequences of his crimes. The internal purge Casso orchestrated within the Lucchese family finds a grim echo in the history of the Gambino family under Paul Castellano, whose own planned purge of the ambitious and unpredictable John Gotti directly led to his own assassination on a midtown Manhattan street. A clear example of how the preemptive elimination of perceived rivals often creates the very conditions for a violent counterreaction, either from the survivors or from the intended targets who strike first to save themselves. The legendary bank robber Willie Sutton, when asked why he robbed banks, famously replied, "Because that's where the money is," and Casso operated on a similar, albeit more sophisticated, principle when he targeted JFK Airport. But Sutton's straightforward approach led to a life in and out of prison, while Casso's complex and corrupt enterprise led to a life sentence, suggesting that the scale and ambition of the crime directly correlates to the severity and finality of the punishment. The most profound parallel, however, lies in the universal flaw of trust, or the lack thereof. From Lucky Luciano, who was ultimately betrayed by his own testimony to save himself from a drug charge, to Whitey Bulger, whose alliance with the FBI became the instrument of his own destruction. The history of the American mobster is a history of betrayal, and Anthony Casso stands as one of its most pure and extreme examples. A man who betrayed everyone, his victims, his partners, his family, his oath, and finally, the government he sought to use, ensuring his complete and total isolation. These parallels are not mere historical curiosities. They form a repetitive and tragic cycle that reveals the Mafia not as a noble secret society but as a fundamentally unstable and self-devouring enterprise, a perpetual motion machine of ambition, paranoia, and treachery that grinds down even its most capable and ruthless operators, spitting them out broken, imprisoned, or dead. The story of Anthony Casso, when viewed through this wider lens, loses its uniqueness and becomes simply another iteration of a classic American tragedy, a tale as old as organized crime itself, where the hunger for power ignites a fire that eventually consumes the one who lit it, a fire that burns brightly for a time, illuminating a path of fear and obedience, but which inevitably exhausts its fuel and collapses into ashes, leaving behind only the cold, hard lesson that in the underworld, there are no happy endings, only varying degrees of defeat, and that the highest ranks of power are often just the most gilded and inescapable of cages. To study Casso is to study this cycle in its most concentrated and virulent form, to see the ghost of Capone's ambition, the shadow of Gotti's arrogance, and the spectre of Gravano's betrayal all merged into one singular, destructive force, a force that, for a brief and terrifying moment, believed it could rewrite the rules of the game, only to discover, too late, that the game was rigged from the start, and that the house, in the form of the relentless and patient machinery of justice, always wins in the end. The final, inescapable conclusion one must draw from the sprawling and violent tapestry of Anthony Casso's life is that he was, in the most clinical and terrifying sense, a perfect weapon, a human instrument of such refined and focused destructive capability that he temporarily made himself indispensable to the criminal ecosystem that created him, only to ultimately reveal the fatal flaw inherent in any tool that possesses neither an off switch nor a loyalty to its wielder, a flaw that ensures it will eventually turn on the very hand that guides it. From his earliest days in Bensonhurst, he was being sharpened and honed, his natural lack of empathy and his comfort with violence carefully polished by the environment around him until he became a blade of exceptional sharpness, a weapon that the Lucchese family could point at its most intractable problems with the absolute confidence that the problem would be permanently and efficiently eliminated. His value was not just in his willingness to kill, but in the cold, intelligent deliberation he brought to the act. He was not a blunt instrument but a precision tool, a scalpel compared to the sledgehammers of lesser thugs, capable of analyzing a threat, planning its removal, and executing the plan with a dispassionate efficiency that left no room for error or remorse. This made him the ultimate problem solver in a world where the ultimate problem was always a person who needed to disappear. And for years, the family benefited from this unique and deadly asset, using him to consolidate power, eliminate rivals, and enforce a level of fear that kept the money flowing and the organization secure. His promotion to underboss was the logical endpoint of this process, the moment the weapon was given the authority to choose its own targets, a catastrophic miscalculation that mistrusted tactical brilliance for strategic wisdom and failed to understand that a knife does not become a wise king when placed on a throne. It simply becomes a knife with the authority to cut anyone it perceives as a threat, including the fingers of the hand that holds it. This is precisely what happened when Casso and Amuso began their purge. The weapon, now autonomous and guided by its own paranoid programming, began to target the very body it was supposed to protect, slicing away experienced capos and reliable earners, weakening the structural integrity of the family in a misguided attempt to strengthen its own position. The flight into hiding was the weapon being dropped and lost, its guidance system reduced to the frantic, erratic signals of fear, its effectiveness neutered by its isolation from the world it was designed to operate within. His decision to cooperate was the weapon jamming and then inexplicably turning itself over to the enemy's armory, offering up all its secrets of operation and design in the vain hope of being spared the smelter. And even then, in this final, submissive role, the weapon malfunctioned. It could not help but lie about its own specifications. It attempted to secretly sabotage its new users, and it proved so fundamentally unreliable that it was ultimately deemed worthless and thrown onto the scrap heap of a supermax prison, deemed too dangerous and deceitful to be of any further use to anyone. His final years at ADX Florence were the long, slow process of letting the perfected weapon rust in silence, each passing day dulling its edge, corroding its mechanisms, and erasing its purpose, until all that remained was the inert, oxidized shape of what it once was, a relic in a sealed container, its terrifying potential now just a memory, its power neutralized not by a superior weapon, but by the simple, patient, and absolute power of nothingness. He was designed for action, for sound, for impact, and he was placed in a world devoid of all three, a form of torture tailored specifically to the essence of what he was. Anthony Casso was not a failed businessman or a flawed leader. He was a perfectly engineered killing machine that achieved every operational objective it was ever given, but which lacked the one component that could have granted it longevity and purpose, a soul. He was a masterpiece of criminal utility and a catastrophic failure of humanity, a creation that ultimately destroyed its creators and then itself, a stark lesson in the dangers of building an empire on a foundation of living weapons. For weapons do not dream of legacy or peace, they only dream of their next use, and when there is nothing left to cut or kill, they are left with only the silent, empty reality of their own obsolescence. A reality that for Anthony Gaspipe Casso stretched out 4 years in a silent, concrete room, a perfect void for a perfectly hollow man. The ultimate and most profound tragedy of Anthony Casso's life, a tragedy that transcends the body count, the financial ruin, and the shattered institutions, lies in the complete and utter emptiness of his final victory. The hollow prize he fought so ruthlessly to obtain, for he achieved the power he so desperately craved, he reached the pinnacle of the only world that mattered to him, and he discovered that the summit was not a throne of gold and respect, but a desolate peak of paranoia and isolation where the only thing he truly commanded was his own accelerating downfall. He won the game he set out to play, He became the underboss of a powerful Mafia family. He accumulated wealth beyond the dreams of the boy from Bensonhurst, and he forged a reputation so fearsome that his very name could silence a room. Yet these victories were revealed to be illusions, mirages that evaporated the moment he tried to grasp them, leaving him with nothing but the dry taste of ash and the terrifying realization that he had sacrificed his entire life for a prize that did not exist. The power he wielded was a corrosive force that isolated him from other human beings, forcing him to see every friend as a potential betrayer and every subordinate as a hidden assassin, creating a prison of suspicion long before the state ever built one of concrete and steel for him, a gilded cage where he was the most prominent and terrified inmate. The wealth he amassed, while funding a life of superficial luxury, became a burden that required constant protection and laundering, a source of anxiety that tied him to ever more dangerous and complex criminal schemes, and ultimately proved useless in saving him from the consequences of his actions, unable to bribe the judges who sentenced him or purchase a single moment of genuine peace in his final years. The respect he commanded was exposed as nothing more than fear in a cheap disguise, a performance put on by men who secretly despised him and who were waiting for the first sign of weakness to either betray him or celebrate his fall, a fact made terrifyingly clear when so many of his own soldiers willingly provided evidence to the government, proving that the loyalty he took by force was as fragile as glass and just as easily shattered. His very identity, the fearsome persona of Gaspipe, the cunning and invincible predator, was a mask that eventually fused to his face, becoming a trap that allowed for no other expression, no moment of vulnerability, no genuine connection, until the man beneath the legend ceased to exist, consumed by the monster he had worked so hard to create. His final, desperate gamble to save himself through cooperation was the ultimate admission of this emptiness, a confession that all the power, all the money, and all the fear he had accumulated were worthless in the face of a life sentence, that the empire he built was a house of cards that collapsed at the first strong wind of federal prosecution. And even in this, he failed to find redemption or peace, his own pathological nature preventing him from honestly adhering to the terms of the deal, ensuring that his last chance for a different ending was squandered, leaving him with the worst of all possible outcomes: the eternal hatred of the world he betrayed and the contempt of the world he tried to join. His final 2 decades in the sensory deprivation of ADX Florence were the physical manifestation of this internal void, a perfect external representation of the nothingness that had always been at his core, a life defined by violent action and loud confrontations ending in a silence so absolute it must have been a torture far beyond any physical pain the state could ever inflict. He died as he lived, entirely alone, not in a dramatic shootout or a prison yard ambush, but slowly and anonymously from a disease, his passing a bureaucratic footnote, his legacy a warning, his entire life's work amounting to a mountain of pain for others and a single, unmarked grave for himself. The story of Anthony Casso is therefore not a story of a man who lost, but of a man who won everything he thought he wanted and discovered that his winnings were counterfeit, that the treasure chest he fought so hard to open was filled with dust and shadows. He is a permanent testament to the futility of a life dedicated solely to the acquisition of power through terror, a walking, talking cautionary tale that reminds us that the most terrible poverty is not a lack of money, but a lack of purpose beyond the self, and that the most desolate prison is not made of bars, but of the choices we make to wall ourselves off from the warmth of trust, the comfort of love, and the simple, profound dignity of a life lived with even a shred of honor. His tragedy was that he never understood this, that he died as he lived, believing the world had failed him, never realizing that he had failed at the world, a blind man cursing the darkness he himself had created. And so, the story of Anthony Gaspipe Casso reaches its inevitable and silent end, not with a bang but with the slow, inexorable whisper of a name fading into the cold, impersonal records of the American penal system. A life that roared with the fury of gunfire and the clamor of ambition concluding in the sterile quiet of a prison infirmary, leaving behind not a legacy of honor or even of fearsome legend, but a chilling blueprint of a soul's utter annihilation, a comprehensive map of how a human being can be systematically stripped of everything that gives life meaning, connection, purpose, and finally, his own freedom, through the relentless pursuit of a power that was, from the very beginning, a magnificent and hollow illusion. His journey from the vibrant, chaotic streets of Bensonhurst to the soundproof concrete coffin of ADX Florence serves as the ultimate morality play for our time, a stark and unflinching narrative that dissects the romanticized myth of the gangster and exposes the raw, pathetic reality that lies beneath. A frightened, hollow man who confused terror with respect, accumulation with success, and survival with living. We have followed his path through the blood-soaked arenas of his criminal triumphs, through the labyrinth of his paranoid mind, and into the bleak, absolute solitude of his punishment, and in doing so, we have witnessed the complete cycle of a life consumed by its own darkest impulses, a self-cannibalizing existence that ultimately had nowhere left to turn but inward upon itself. The rise, the reign, and the ruin of Anthony Casso stand as a monumental warning, a historical marker etched in pain and betrayal, reminding us that the laws of decency and the bonds of community are not mere social constructs but vital defenses against the inner darkness that men like Casso not only embraced but celebrated, and that when these laws and bonds are broken, the descent into the abyss is not only possible, it is guaranteed. His story is a gift of clarity, a brutal education in cause and effect, showing with terrifying precision how a single choice to embrace violence over compassion can set in motion a chain reaction of destruction that expands outward to shatter families, corrupt institutions, and poison communities, before finally, and most justly, collapsing back inward to annihilate the one who made that initial, fatal choice. He is a lesson written in the blood of his victims, the tears of their families, and the silent, rusting metal of his own prison cell, a lesson that screams from the pages of history that a life lived without a moral compass is a journey into a wilderness from which there is no return, a voyage that may be marked by temporary conquests and fleeting power, but whose final destination is always, always, a profound and unanswerable loneliness. Let the echo of his name, Gaspipe, no longer signify a feared gangster, but instead serve as a synonym for the emptiness of a path chosen without light, without love, and without a single thought for the sanctity of others. Let his memory not be one of dark fascination, but of sober reflection on the fragility of our own choices and the immense value of the peaceful, connected lives we so often take for granted. The tale is told. The evidence is laid bare. The violent, treacherous, and ultimately pointless journey of Anthony Casso is complete. The screen fades to black, not on the image of a powerful Don, but on the stark, simple truth of a man who had everything a criminal could ever want and nothing that a human being truly needs. He sought to become a king, and he died a prisoner. He sought to build a legacy, and he became a cautionary tale. He sought to control his world, and in the end, he could not even control his own destiny. This is the final, unassailable truth of his existence. The story is over. The lesson, however, remains. Let it linger. Let it inform. Let it guide. If this deep dive into the dark and complex world of organized crime held your attention, if you found the rise and fall of Anthony Casso to be a compelling story of power, paranoia, and ultimate downfall, then please show your support for this channel. Your engagement is what allows us to continue unearthing these detailed, factual narratives and presenting them in this comprehensive story-style format. Please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel for more in-depth explorations of true crime and history, and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new story. We rely on you, our audience, to help us grow and continue this work. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What aspect of Casso's psychology or his downfall did you find most shocking or revealing? We read every comment and value this community of thoughtful viewers. Thank you for your time and for your commitment to understanding the full, unvarnished truth of history's most compelling and dark figures.